8:39. I better, yeah. Hello, everyone. Oh, hello. Can everyone hear me? Uh, Welcome, everyone. So pleased to see all of you. It's been 2 years since I saw many of you gathered here, and a lot has happened since then. So, but most importantly, here we are. You know, we're gathered here for this wonderful conference, another iteration, the 23rd iteration of the International Conference on Historical Linguistics. So I hope that you've already been getting acclimated, and we're going to try to get you introduced to a few things this morning, our little welcome comments. And then we'll be off on our pretty exciting program. So as I've sent you a few missives, a few letters as we prepared for this, so you know some of the things that I want to be sure you know. For one thing, well, welcome, of course. Did some of you see this on when you came at in the airport? We had it up on the electronic screen. Those of you who speak Hebrew noticed that that wasn't quite right, but we fixed it. We fixed it. Here it is. That's correct here. This is our distribution across the world. So we have 40 countries represented. So that's a matter of pride, you know, amongst us. This is truly an international gathering, and we have 6 continents represented. So we have an array of plenaries. We have 8 plenary lectures. So all week long we'll be having plenty of plenaries. We'll have 9 workshops, all located all presented on Thursday and Friday. And we'll have some special panels that I'll tell you about in just a moment. We have had 2 wonderful digital workshops that took place on Sunday, phylogenetics and text mining. And we'll have another really interesting event, a special roundtable that I'll tell you about, and another special session. So a couple of really nice special sessions, and then, of course, the general session. So that's something that ITCHL always focuses upon, too, is just all of us presenting at the general session. So I wanted to give a little bit of focus to the fact that you don't know this, most of you don't know this, but you are initiating our tricentennial celebration pretty much right now. And tricentennial, in other words, that San Antonio is celebrating its 300th birthday in 2018, the recognition of the first settlement by Spanish settlers in 1718. And so that we're having a year-long tricentennial celebration, and we have become an official event of that. We're kind of, you know, forward-looking in 2017. So we've designed 4 of our panels, which have a focus, which can be tied to our San Antonio history as well. Of course, they're worldwide, they're internationally, you know, international scholars who come here and will speak about an array of things, but we're tying these to our birthday celebration. And so this is our beautiful design tiles. You see them everywhere, so that's in recognition of especially our Spanish and Mexican heritage. So I want to just remind you what the 4 panels will be. So you'll visit them. Today, one of them begins. It's Spanish Socio-Historical Linguistics, Isolation and Contact. So it will be truly an exciting gathering, worldwide scholars focusing on these issues. Tomorrow in the morning, we will have African American Vernacular English and the Ecology of Language Evolution. Dr. Bailey, for example, will be participating in that, and many other distinguished scholars. And then Tuesday evening amongst the panels is the History of Texas German. This has got many people in our community also quite excited because there is a huge German history in our city. So some people from the community will be also attending to enjoy the introduction to how German established itself in Texas. And this is Tuesday evening. And then finally of the panels is Endangered Languages and Historical Linguistics, all day long on Thursday. So another distinguished group of people will be studying endangered languages of the world, the nature of endangerment, and lesser studied languages. And 4 of our plenary lectures are also based upon or connected to endangered languages. So it's one of the major focuses of our conference here is to really look at what are the effects, how does endangerment occur, and how does that tie into what historical linguists are interested in? What can we tell about historical linguistics, the history and historical linguistics based upon studying lesser studied languages rather than just standard languages? And finally, in this collection of little introductions here, I want to make sure you all know about this really special roundtable that we've organized. And this is on Tuesday afternoon. And this is to recognize the reissue, the republication of that very well-known dictionary, Directions for Historical Linguistics, which was published 50 years ago. That's my copy that I've taken a picture of. It costs $3.50. I've got it stamped in there. Things have changed, So this is going to be reissued. And you can see the scholars we've gathered around here. You can see Malkiel, Lehmann, Benveniste, Kuriwovic, and then Weinreich, Labov, and Herzog. And so we are so pleased to have one of these members still with us here who is going to present and really launch this republication, William Labov. And Gillian Sankoff will also be, they together will be 2 keynote speakers of this roundtable. So it's going to be an exciting event with several very distinguished discussants of what's the nature of historical linguistics? What's happened in the interim? What's happened in the intervening years since 50 years ago, but also reaching back before that? And where are we headed? So, I hope you'll be able to attend some of these sessions as well. Well, we also, while we're doing this little bit of orientation here, I want you to know you've had a chance to look at the program, I hope, and sign up for the social program. So we've got some fun things to do. You've noticed it's hot. I told you it was hot when I wrote to you, but now you know the reality of hot, because it was about 100 degrees Fahrenheit yesterday. Someone said it was going to be cooler today, the 90s. So I don't know what that is. Still in the 30s in centigrade, so it is warm. But we've planned a number of activities which we will try to keep you rather cool. So that's why we're here on the Riverwalk, because it is the coolest place in town. It's sort of below street level. It's down by the water. There's lots of shade. So, and we've provided sunscreen in your packets, just to be sure. Keep you protected. So tonight we'll be starting off with our social program, and we'll be sending you out. It's a tradition of Itchel to do a city walk. So we're doing instead a city boat ride, because that's what you do down here in downtown San Antonio. You take the boats, and so you'll get your tour of all the sites, from the boat. If you haven't signed up for that, it's free. So just you can go out. We can only accommodate 200 people, and we're getting there. So, we'd like to know if you're interested in doing that. And after that, then there will be a nice reception at the Briscoe, which is very near to here. If you don't want to ride the boats, you can just walk over to the Briscoe. It's practically next door to the Hotel Contessa, and it'll be a really nice. And that's also free for all participants. It's upscale Mexican that we're going to be having, and I'm really excited about this. I've been planning this for 2 years. This is something I had immediately in mind when I knew I was going to organize this, is that we're bringing, it's the Austin Baroque Orchestra, and they're going to perform music of the Spanish Renaissance, which was brought to the New World. And so that means for you linguists, not just the musical side, but also some of the Native American languages, which, they'll be singing in some of those Native American languages. So it's both in early modern Spanish and then also in some of the, other languages. So it's going to be a true pleasure on period instruments too. So come and enjoy. On Wednesday, we always have our afternoon excursions. So we've got the Alamo for you to visit. We've got the missions for you to visit. You choose, and that we're gathering little artifacts out there to share with our the descendants of the mission families, and I appreciate your bringing that. We notified you rather late in the game, but we saw that you've been providing some of those. So thank you for doing that. That'll be fun to give a basket to them. You could also go to the San Antonio Museum of Art and the Pearl District. So those are our choices there. Then, if you've got any energy left, please save some energy because we're going out to Green. And so this is, and I've heard from Dr. Bailey that he's going to also mention this too. So you'll get even more excited about Green. Green Hall is the oldest dance hall in Texas. So just right up the road, just a 40-minute ride, and so we'll go out there. It's a little old German, it's a ghost town, but now it's kind of revitalized, for dancers and shoppers. But it's, a charming place, and so you'll enjoy if you like to dance a little bit. It will be hot again, and they have beer. and we'll have dinner first on your own dinner at the Gristmill. Very charming place too. So let's go dance. And then on Saturday, as usual, we'll have some excursions. This one happens to be Fredericksburg. So there's the German Hill Country tour. There's going to Austin. We're going to Bandera Cowboy excursion on horses through the river. The river, that's the cool part of that. You're going to ride horses, and the horses are going to go through the river, the Medina River. And if you really want to be cool, tubing. Tubing means getting on an inner tube and going down a river, the Guadalupe River. So, just depends on what level of energy you want to apply to your excursion. So we've got some nice, cool things to do. I think I want to take just a tiny moment to remind you of the layout of our venue here. You may have been getting used to it, and so you will get used to it. It may just take a day or so. The only bottleneck is really the elevators there, but there is one staircase that you can sneak up and down on that's down by the Inaqua room that way. So that's something good for you to know, to have in your back pocket if you get tired of waiting for the elevators. But almost everything is taking place right on this floor. So you found your way here, so you're well on your way, So the large things will take place in the ballroom, and then we have breakout rooms in the Magnolia Room. That's the biggest other one. Just down there, that's where the coffee break will be. And we'll have everybody gathered at one coffee break so you can really, meet everyone together. We'll all gather there each time. So we'll have 2 coffee breaks, morning and afternoon. And then, of course, we have like the Inaqua room, the Laurel room, the Palm room, and the Cedar room. So those are our 4 rooms that are sort of out there towards the river. And so you'll be able to look on the map and find your way there. We'll have a 5-minute passing period. So, at the beginning you may want to clip and, if you have to move rooms, but then it'll get easier. We have T-shirts. They're going fast. So, well, we ordered a few more. We just decided, people are kind of liking this. So we'll have some more on Wednesday. So if you don't get one right now, you'll be able to get one later for $12. We have a book exhibit, and it's being set up. It is pretty much set up, and that's over in the Ratama room. So over by the coffee area is where you will be able to go to the book exhibit. We will have more information on a raffle that we will have for graduate students of books. I'll just tell you more about that in the future. And then I just wanted to go ahead and offer our special thanks to some of our sponsors. I'll probably be thanking you, thanking these special people a couple of times, but I wanted to do this right at the opening, right before, as we begin, to say thanks to the many, many people. First of all, I got to say thanks to our interns. So anybody who's got a teal shirt, stand up. Let them see. Some of them are standing out there, but you see these teal shirts? Yay! These people. Oh my goodness, they've been working hard. We had a whole graduate class last semester where I prepared them for this, and they've just risen to the occasion. It's been wonderful. And people in gray shirts, likewise, are also volunteers. So yes, please, be grateful to them, but they'll guide you and help you in any way. Yes, the gray shirts too, the undergraduates. The local organizing committee has been just wonderful. All kinds of different aspects of this. We've planned together. And so thanks to all of you who've been, hard at work planning this panel, that panel, all the scientific committees and things. So thank you to the scientific committee, thank you to the local organizing committee, thanks to all, administrators who have helped us. And then I also want to recognize that we are sponsored in part by the National Science Foundation, which is a matter of great pride to me because this is recognizing linguistics as a science, and so yes, we should be. Humanities Texas is sponsoring us, Oak Ridge Associated Universities, there's a Japan Society for Promotion of Science, Casa de España, the City of San Antonio International Relations, Austin Baroque Orchestra, and Staples, who printed many of our posters and programs, Walgreens, providing you water and the sunscreen, and Dr. Chiscano, I would also like to recognize. Dr. Chiscano has brought us something special that if you would like to learn about the Canary Islands, which we have a special relationship with as San Antonio, this is where our first large colony of residents came from, and so the descendants still live in San Antonio. So Dr. Chiscano has brought a special film that will be shown during the afternoon coffee break about Canary Island whistling communication system. So I hope you'll just pop in for this. This is really an exciting thing that he has brought. Dr. Chiscano, would you stand up and would just say thank you for your sponsorship and interest? And finally, many UTSA administrators have been, offices have helped. UT Austin has lent a hand, has also sponsored us. Also, UT Rio Grande Valley has been very generous in its funding of us. Texas State, so we have lots of university sponsorship, and Texas A&M, both Texas A&M San Antonio and Texas A&M College Station. So I feel that we are, we're really bringing, people are on board with this, and so we're hoping that it all shows that we, how much work has been put into this and how much support there is. I believe that it is, I don't know if Dr. Jello has arrived. Is he here? Elizabeth, is Dr. Jello here? Do you know? Okay, ask Deborah. But we could go ahead and begin with our keynote introduction, and then Dr. Jello is the dean. He's the dean of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts, and so he's the one that's going to open our conference. But we'll begin instead with our keynote, and then we'll reverse the order, and then you'll be hearing from Dean Jello. So I'm just so pleased to be able to bring our former provost. So he has a long UTSA connection. And present-day first president of the University of the Rio Grande Valley, University of Texas of the Rio Grande Valley, Professor Guy Bailey.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can.
I have to get off of here, though. I'm sorry. Let me just escape. Okay.
Now, if you wonder why Dean Jello hasn't shown up, it's probably because I appointed him dean about 15 years ago. And I'm sure he hasn't forgiven me for doing that. So if you'll give me just a second, I'll get this started. Okay, did that come up yet? First of all, I want to welcome you all here, tell you what an honor it is for me to be here. I spent a number of years in San Antonio. It's a city very dear to my heart and a place that I really love. I'll talk a little more about it as we go along. UTSA is a wonderful university. I started there 20 years ago this August and had a wonderful time and met people like Bridget. There were fine faculty there, and they've done a terrific job. But also, I spent much of my adult life in Texas. I grew up in Alabama, but moved to Texas as an adult in 1982. Fell in love with the state, most things about the state, and found it was a great place to study what was happening with the English language. And I think especially fitting today that we're doing, or during this week we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Directions in Historical Linguistics. It was one of the things that most influenced me many years ago, and I got one of those $3 copies too. That's how you can tell how old you are. It's how much you paid for your copy of that book. And so, anyway, so it was very, very influential. But I found that Texas English was particularly interesting to study for a couple of reasons. A couple of things about Texas. By the way, I have to. I'm sorry.
Oh yes, just hit slideshow.
Okay, you can show me that.
Okay. Right there.
My
Slideshow.
grandchildren could kind of help me out here.
There
Yes.
you are.
The way it works is always easier. Anyway, the one thing I learned pretty quickly, and most people are aware of some of this, but not all of this. Texas is a very distinct area culturally, and it has unique origins. It began as part of Mexico, was part of Mexico for a century, or really more than that, and then became an independent country for about 9 years. And so that's an unusual history. It has an unusual settlement history as well, unique settlement history. Of course, for a long time, the population was Spanish-speaking, part of Mexico, and the Hispanic population has been a huge part of the state its entire history. Much of the early settlement of Texas came from the other parts of the American South, and this included a number of African Americans, most of whom were brought as slaves. And this, again, the early settlement of Texas from the American South, part of the expansion of the cotton culture. But then it becomes more distinctive after the Civil War. Quite a bit of settlement directly from Europe. This distinguishes Texas from most of the rest of the American South. Settlement directly from Germany and Czechoslovakia, Austria. Remember, all of you remember the name Hans Kurrat, right? The Dean of American Linguistic Geography. Hans Kurrat, born in Austria when he was 10 years old, about 1900. His parents moved to Texas, and he grew up in Texas, right? Texas German. It was a part of that migration to the state. The first Polish settlement in the United States is Santa Maria, Texas, not too far east of here. And so Texas was in this settlement directly from Europe had a remarkable impact on the culture of the state. A little more about that in just a second. But you'll see some of it when you go to Green Hall. By the way, wear your coolest clothes, not air conditioned. Okay, it's a great place, but wear your cool clothes. And then since the middle of the 20th century, Texas has seen significant migration from other states and even more recently from other countries as well. There's a great deal of international migration into Texas as well. And then natural increase. Texas has always grown faster than the rest of the states through natural increase as well. So all of that you've had significant population growth and a different population mix in the state. And so what this means is that you have a unique composition of population, you have unique cultural institutions and forms of cultural expressions, a significant Texas literary tradition. I won't talk about that, but you may have seen some, if you saw the miniseries Lonesome Dove. I mean, it's part of what, you have a distinct literary tradition. But more important is what happened when the Central Europeans settled here. They set up a dance hall tradition in all the little towns in Texas, and Green is the oldest continuously operating one. I think it was built in 1868, but beginning in the 1870s and 1880s, every little town had its dance hall. It was dance halls and churches. So if you go to Schulenburg, for instance, you can see the dance hall and what they call painted churches, beautifully decorated churches in the area. So, and again, when you hear that Austin is the live music capital of the world, that really goes back to this tradition, right? It's this tradition that was set up by the Central European migrants who came to Texas back in the 19th century. All of that led to distinct musical expression as well. If you're in San Antonio, you have to listen to some conjunto music if you get a chance. It's terrific. It's working class Mexican-American music. Unlike mariachi bands, this is accordion-based, and it reflects the interaction of Mexican Americans with German Americans, Czech Americans. Remember, it's accordion based, and so you'll recognize polka influences and everything else. But a lot of times you go to Market Square, you can hear it there. Or if you get a Flaco Jimenez CD, he's probably the best practitioner. And then Western Swing, which is an amalgamation of almost every kind. Bob Wills was the originator of this, an amalgamation of most kinds of American music put together, but distinct musical expressions. And then Texas has always been distinct in the imagination, I think, as well. And if we stick to the music piece here, if you go onto your iTunes, you'll find there are far more songs about Texas than any other state. I mean, people write songs about it all the time, and there's an amazing range of things. If you drive in Texas, you can always listen to the song "You Can't Get the Hell Out of Texas." Right? It's a real big. You drive forever and you're still here. So, but virtually everything. And so if you think about that, that's part of the imagination. There are at least 50 Texas towns and cities that have songs about them. Yes, you expect Dallas or Houston, but what about Snyder, right? What about Idalou? I guarantee you probably don't know where those are, and you'd have to work to get there, right? You don't drive past them. You gotta really work. Memphis, Texas, not Memphis, Tennessee. There are 2 songs about Memphis, Texas, right? You'd have a hard time locating. So the point is, it's part of the imagination and part of the heart for lots of people as well. Now, if you go on iTunes or Apple, something like that, and you look at what U.S. city has the most songs about it, you're sitting in that city right now. Now, it's not New York, not Chicago, it's San Antonio. Check that out. It's a remarkable. When I was driving in yesterday from Big Bend, I have a playlist of songs about San Antonio. For a couple of hours, you can listen to nothing but San Antonio songs. And if you're driving from Big Bend, you need something to entertain you. So there's nothing along the way. So, but the point is, it has a special place in the imagination. So, given that most people assume there's kind of a distinct Texas English, I got to tell you, there are really no features of Texas speech that are unique in Texas. Most everything occurs somewhere else. It's the combination of features that are probably unique. And of course, the basis of Texas English is really the Southern American English that was brought by Anglo settlers from Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana in the 19th century. But you have to keep in mind some other things. Languages other than English have always been spoken in Texas. Some of you will go to the Pearl Brewery, and when the Pearl Brewery was being renovated, and I was provost at UTSA, we were looking at trying to get in on that. There were some old documents found there. Until World War I, you had to speak German to work there, right? And it was just a requirement. And so German, Czech, Spanish has always been spoken. I mean, it's something that's always occurred. And so those languages have had an impact. There's always been a great deal of bilingualism in the state. Remember, in Texas, there were never any English-only movements or anything like that. You couldn't. You had a state whose history always included that. Bilingualism, multilingualism, especially where I live, most people are bilingual to some extent. And you can get by in English only, you can get by in Spanish only, but most people know a little bit of both. And then all of these languages have had an impact on English. E. Babbitt Atwood in the early 60s documented some of this. But the important thing from my point of view is that during the course of the 20th and now the 21st century, Texas English has undergone significant change. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I promise not to take too long here, and talk about that in light of the synchronic approach to language change. And of course, the guy who first formulated this synchronic approach to language change is with us today. And until really the 1960s, the assumption is that you couldn't study language change as it was happening. You had to study its results. You could study it only through its results, but then Labov had some insights that kind of revolutionized how we look at language change. And there were two of them that were really critical. And one was the intimate relationship between change and variation, and more importantly, that you could quantify the variation, and by looking at that variation quantitatively, could begin to get some insight into change. And the second thing was that you could track linguistic variation in the speech of different generations of adults, what he called apparent time. And if you examine that and other aspects of distribution of features, you could actually begin to explore language change as it was taking place. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about that in the 20th and 21st centuries. Labov also made a point in 1994 that I found extremely interesting when I read it and shed a lot of light on what was happening in Texas. He points out that catastrophic events, and by this, not catastrophes, not hurricanes, not tornadoes. We have those here. We have them both. And although you very rarely have tornadoes down here, but those kind of catastrophes are not what he's talking about. He's talking about population dislocations. It played a major role in the history of all languages, primarily in the form of population dislocations, migrations, invasions, conquests, massive immigrations. Such catastrophic changes are more common than previously believed, and the history of many urban speech communities lead us to expect massive population changes several times in a century rather than once in a millennium. And Texas is a good example of that. It's experienced massive population changes really over the last century, and so it's an excellent laboratory for exploring the linguistic consequences of catastrophic events, and I want to talk about that just a little bit. Now, in doing this, I want to use some trend surveys to study the effects of these catastrophic events. And of course, trend surveys are cross-sectional surveys of a population done at different points of time, and they work best if you can replicate the methods. If one survey replicates another, if you don't, you've got methodological issues that you have to factor in as well. And so there are three linguistic surveys of Texas that allow us for trend analysis in the state. I want to talk just briefly about those that I and my colleagues did. One's what we call a phonological survey of Texas, PST, and a grammatical investigation of Texas speech. These were done in 1989. And then in 2014-15, we did a linguistic survey of the southern Great Plains. And these are all telephone surveys. I'll talk more about the methods in just a minute. So this gives us a 25-year perspective on change in Texas English. A little bit about them. The first two are large-scale random sample tape-recorded telephone surveys, and they were the first such surveys to actually tape-record telephone interviews. And what we did, we piggybacked on a commercial survey, the Texas Poll, and we were able to tape record that. And the primary goals, the research goals I've laid out there is basically you want a linguistic snapshot of the state at one point in time, and that's the important thing for us. But as I said, we piggyback these on the Texas Poll, and the great advantage of this, you can get your data in 3 weeks. It took us about 6 months to transcribe this stuff, but you can collect the data pretty quickly. And your interviews were with 1,000 randomly selected Texans, and so that mirrors the demographic and social composition of the state, and you have a confidence interval, a specified known confidence interval, and it's a rich source of apparent time data for the state as a whole. I'll come back to that. That's an important point for the state as a whole. And then if you can compare it to the LSSGP, the Survey of the Great Plains, you've got the real-time evidence on linguistic developments in the state. The primary weakness of something like PST and GRITS is spatial coverage. Remember, if you mirror most of the population of Texas down along I-35 and in Houston, so it's not very good spatial coverage. So when you do apparent time stuff, it's skewed a little bit spatially. So we tried to, when we did this second survey, which we commissioned and did, Tom Weichel was my co-conspirator on this at Oklahoma State. And it's also a tape-recorded random sample telephone survey. We did Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. We'd also done some of these things in Oklahoma. The Texas portion of this survey includes 880 informants, and it's an independent survey, and you can see the dates when it was done, and the confidence, again, you have a known specified confidence interval. And again, what we were really trying to do was find real-time benchmarks. This gave us a great test of apparent time, but also real-time benchmarks to see what was happening over time in the state. We modified the research method to, this was not a simple random sample, but it is a random sample. It's probability proportionate to size sampling design. And so I'm not going to go into the details. I'll be happy to talk about those later. But the last point is important here. We wanted to look at apparent time. So in each enumeration area, we had somebody about 20, we had 20 people interviewed because we wanted to get somebody about 20, somebody about 40, somebody about 60, somebody about 80 to give us a good age distribution there. And again, I'm going to skip some of the details here, but you could. This is the linguistic survey of the and again.
It's not showing.
Oh, it's not showing.
It's not showing. VGA? Okay. Connection. I don't know what.
I think this just got bumped.
Oh, it got bumped.
Oh, did I bump?
There we go. We'll tape that.
Sorry about that. I have a video of my 2-year-old granddaughter. She just turned 2. She has her iPhone out on Snapchat. Doing all this. She'd do much better at this than I would, and she's cuter too. So it's much cuter. So anyway, some quick results from the 89 surveys. During the middle of the 20th century, Texas English began to undergo some really significant changes, and a lot of traditional features in Texas, for example, unrounded vowels in Lord so that it sounds like lard. I'd never, first time I went to church and heard the 23rd Psalm read, "The Lord is my shepherd." Wow, I thought, this is different. This is different. And so, and that feature does occur in a couple of other places, Utah and a little bit Missouri. It was rapidly disappearing, and some other traditional features as well. But there were a number of innovative forms expanding. Some of those were older Southern forms that had begun really in the late 19th century, things like fixing to and monophthongal before voice. I should have put before voiceless obstruents, like in nice and right and white. So those were expanding. And then there were some features that really came from outside the South that were expanding, like unrounded vowels in words like caught, becoming cot, homophonous with cot. So, and there were some important socio-demographic correlates of these things, age and whether you lived in cities or country, and ethnicity as well. And the age differences suggested that the trigger for the extensive change in Texas English was really the World War II, or actually not the war, but the population shifts, the massive population shifts. And remember, it was only the 1950 census where more than half the people in the state lived in communities of 2,500 or greater. If you look at the census definition of urban, that's 2,500 or more. So think about this. This was a rural, small-town state. And anyway, and even as these older innovations in the state began to emerge, some older features like the monophthongal I before voiceless obstruents and fixing to and y'all also seem to have become markers of Texas identity. So a little bit about that data. And again, the last point here I want to make here, there seemed to be a focus for this. The innovation seemed to be sort of focused in the northern Dallas-Fort Worth area, and to a lesser extent Houston, and then spreading down the I-35 corridor. I've got a bad map, unfortunately, that'll show you that in just a minute. But if you want to just visualize the consequences of these population shifts in World War II, if you look at the 2 oldest age groups, the 2 youngest age groups, this is a Shafey test, and so things that are marked on the A's are the innovative forms, B's and C's, D's are not as advanced in innovation, and if you look at this, the younger age groups are significantly ahead of, and it's the people 44 and younger for the most part. This is in 1989, right? in 1989. Remember the date. And the people who were 40, and if you look at again, that's 1945 and after 1945 and before. So you can see you begin to see visually the consequences of the age shifts. I mentioned this is an urban-rural thing. If you look at again, you can see the clustering together of the large and small metros versus the towns and rural areas there with these innovative features. So, and I mentioned identity. If you look at Monophthongali before voiceless obstruents, you can simply correlate that with people's rating of Texas as a place to live, which was a survey question. You can see people who thought this was an excellent or good state had a lot of nice and right, and people who thought it was poor did not. So anyway, and you can see that expansion of that Monophthongali over time there. And the effects of ethnicity created some very strange configurations because in some cases Latinos were in the lead, like in the unrounded vowels in caught. And so in some cases Anglos and African Americans grouped together, in some cases Anglos and Latinos, in some cases they were all separate. So there were some interesting ethnic configurations that need to be worked out. In the spatial configurations, I mentioned my map wasn't very good, but you can see, I think, on this map, the focus and the spread down I-35. So in any event, what's happened since 1990, if you'll give me about 5 or 6 minutes, I think I can talk about some interesting things that have happened since the last thing was done. Texas has continued to undergo further demographic shifts, pretty radical shifts. It's grown much faster than the rest of the U.S. The sources of population growth have changed, a lot of domestic and especially international migration. You always think of the international migration as being from Latin America, Central and South America. That was generally true until recently, but now almost as much comes from Asia. So the sources of population change are dramatic in the state. There's a lot of natural increase in the state, but more of that is among Hispanics. And everybody in the Rio Grande Valley, everybody has large families. So we have one hospital that delivers over 900 babies a month, right, in one city. Hey, but that's an elementary school every month, a high school every 3 months, and a college every year. Think about that. So, and then the urban-rural split's been exacerbated by the continuing loss of rural populations, and as you can imagine, that has some linguistic consequences. I'm going to kind of skip through these, but you can see from this map the demographic changes, that everything in red is losing population, everything in blue is growing rapidly. And you can see the blue down the I-35 corridor down in South Texas, where I live, and over in Houston. But again, if you look at the demographic change, almost all of the growth in Texas was Latino population. The Hispanic population grew between 2000 and 2010 by almost 42%, and compare that to, it's dramatic. And so the state is changing, right before your eyes, and there are linguistic consequences of that. Again, the sources of population growth, if you add international and domestic migration, they add up to more than natural increase. And remember, most of that natural increase is among Latinos. So what are the linguistic consequences of that? Well, here's a comparison of two features in the earlier surveys and the later surveys. Just simple morphosyntactic things. Fixin' to, might, could. You can see some pretty dramatic change there. Again, in 25 years, fixin' to, for example, used only by about 2/3 instead of more than 3/4 of the population. And if you map that out in apparent time, you can see that whereas this was pretty steady, the blue is the earlier surveys. If you look at the red, which is the most recent survey, there's a dramatic drop-off among millennial Texans in the use of that feature. However, this is mostly a native, non-native thing. If you map out just the natives in the later survey, you can see it's still pretty similar. But remember, most of the population growth now is non-natives, and also the segment of the population that used this form the least among Latinos. So you have rapid change. And so you can see the effects of nativity there on the use of fixin' to, which again had some effect in the earlier surveys, but even more dramatic in the later ones. What's also interesting, if you look at new innovations coming in, quotative be like has been written about a great deal, and it's expanding like crazy in Texas too. What I find interesting is that older people sometimes use it, even people my age and older sometimes use this as well. And what this suggests is lifespan change. You have people even later in life adopting an innovation like this. But among the youngest, among the millennials, it was everywhere, and that's not surprising to any of you, I'm sure. If you contrast that with Fixin' To, you can see the change taking place among the youngest Texans. And again, the effects of nativity on all of this, and you can see with Be Like, quotative Be Like, you can see the nativity effect is just the opposite of everything else. But think about population growth, and you see how the language is going in the state of Texas. Just some quick conclusions here. You know, it's pretty hard to overestimate the role of catastrophism in language change. In Texas, the extensive demographic change has reshaped the linguistic profile of the state a couple of times over the last 60 or 70 years. It created markers of Texas identity, but it's now eliminating those markers that it are reducing the markers that it did create. And it's led to a complex process by which some new features are adopted by newcomers and some old ones or some new ones are adopted by natives that are brought from outside the state. The founder effect can still be detected. I mean, you still see it, but after extensive population change, the one thing that's really clear is that ultimately demography is linguistic destiny, and so you can see how that'll evolve in Texas. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. So I believe at this point, I think I'm going to declare this conference open. I'm going to do it. I do need to make one small note, just a couple of things before we kind of engage in the rest of our program here. One thing is, unfortunately, Henrik Rosenqvist over in Sweden couldn't make it. He just wrote to say he couldn't make the flight, and his talk this morning, which was going to be at 11:15 in the Syntax of Scandinavian Languages, is canceled. But so that we will just leave that space open, so you'll just take a break at that time if you're attending that session. Also wanted to take one brief moment to say to you that, you know, the things that I've been writing to you about the role that San Antonio has been playing in the world scene, I don't want to let this opportunity go by. We were going to have the new mayor of San Antonio here, and he couldn't make it because he's up in Austin kind of fighting the battles for San Antonio let's just put it as it is. It's a sanctuary city. You know, that's the kind of place that this is. This is a place, as we've heard, ongoing connections with Mexico. This is, you know, tightly tied to Mexico and won't cease to be that. Also, the first thing that the mayor did when he came on was to declare that we were with Paris, that this city is definitely abiding by the Paris Accords. So, you know, I know, yes. Whatever anybody else is doing. And many things like this. This is an ecologically savvy city. We're committed to that. And our university, as I've mentioned to you, is the second most populous for the DACA students. So the dreamers. You're first. UTRGV, so, and UTSA is second. I mean, because it's...
That's 1,000 students in the valley.
Yeah, it's just the support for the students who have grown up in Texas that should be in-state students. So that's just recognizing the obvious as far as we're concerned. So I just wanted to be sure that this, I don't want to wax too political whatsoever here, but just wanted to let you know, where you are and how we stand in San Antonio. So at this point now, we will turn the stage over to Marianne Methuen, who is going to give our introduction to our first plenary speaker, Patience Epps.
Let Patty come. What? No, I'm only going to talk for a couple minutes because we want to hear from Patty. Why don't you come on up? You're using your computer? Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to say it's a very special pleasure to introduce Patty because I've known her for a long time and I have so much respect for what she does and who she is. She, as most of you know, I think she's a very special kind of linguist, one who does very fine, sensitive language documentation, and then in its cultural context, its social context, and then looks to see what that tells us about our understanding of language in a lot of ways. So one way is typological, sort of looking to see the wild and crazy things that languages can do that you might not have expected, because she brings us really interesting things from Amazonia, so typologically. And especially what it is that makes languages the way they are, that is looking at how speakers shape their languages and looking at how their culture and their social organization shape their languages and how their interactions shape their languages. So I think it's really wonderful. She sort of takes very sensitive understanding of what's going on and does a lot with it. She's also a special kind of collaborator. She collaborates in really effective ways, I think, with a lot of people, which makes a big difference. She is widely published, and I don't know how she does this. She does a whole lot. As most of you probably know, she wrote an award-winning grammar of Who published my Mouton in the Mouton Grammar series. She's published in sort of all the major journals, so IJAL and Studies in Language and Diachronica, et cetera, linguistic typology. And she sort of does it all, as a good field worker does. So everything from phonology to morphology to lexicon in especially interesting ways, and grammar and discourse and how they're all used. I like very much the titles of her papers. I think they kind of make you want to look at them, and it's always worth it. Just some of the things she's done, sort of starting with vocabulary. She's done an interesting set of papers on the paleobiolinguistics of, and then one is the common bean, and another is domesticated maize, domesticated manioc, domesticated chili pepper, domesticated squash. Then she doesn't just sort of look at individual words, she looks at how the systems evolve, and so she's got a nice series on numerals, on numeral complexity in hunter-gatherer languages, growing a numeral system, the historical development of numerals in an Amazonian language family, inheritance, calquing, or independent innovation, reconstructing morphological complexity. Here's another title I like, grammar. Escape from the noun phrase, from relative clause to converb and beyond in an Amazonian language. Another nice title, From wood, W-O-O-D, to future tense, nominal origins of the future construction in hoop. She's done linking valence, change, and modality. She's done work on aerial diffusion and the development of evidentiality. Upper Rio Negro astronomies at the intersection of daily life, ritual, and verbal art. And I think that captures very nicely the kind of work that she does. And now there's a forthcoming paper on a holistic humanities of speaking, Franz Boas, and the continuing centrality of texts. Patty is a major contributor to our understanding of processes of language change, especially under language contact. Recently, she and colleagues edited a really nice volume on contact among genetically related languages, which is always a problem for us because when you have genetic relationships, first of all, it's hard to tell what's contact and what's not, but second, how does this affect what gets borrowed? Very nice. Other papers, subsistence pattern and contact-driven language change. Does lateral transmission obscure inheritance in hunter-gatherer languages? And of course, she's always looking at what all we find can tell us about earlier prehistory. Language classification, language contact, and Amazonian prehistory, with Lev Michael editing The Aerial Linguistics of Amazonia, Amazonian linguistic diversity and its sociocultural correlates, language and subsistence patterns in the Amazonian Valpes. So I'm not going to talk anymore because I think we want to hear from Patty. So Patty Epps.
Thank you. Is it okay, as tech people, if I move this computer out? Hey, thank you, Eric. So I want to thank Marianne so much for that wonderful introduction. And Marianne has always been one of my linguistic heroes, so really, it means a lot to have you introduce me. And I also want to really thank Bridget Drinka for inviting me to speak here and for all the incredible amount of work that she's put into organizing this conference. As a member of the local organizing committee, I can really speak to the amount that she has shouldered single-handedly and together also with the UTSA team. So we're all very grateful to her. So I'm going to be speaking about the questions of language language contact maintenance and diversification with a focus on the Amazon basin, which is where I have been working for for the past about 17 years. So to begin with, I want to start with the puzzle of variable linguistic diversity as it pertains around the world and the processes of convergence and divergence that underlie these different patterns. There are really multiple ways of thinking about different patterns of linguistic diversity and linguistic variability. So these maps by Gavin et al. 2013 do a nice job of schematizing two of these ways of thinking about linguistic diversity. So the upper map focuses on the diversity of languages, the overall number of languages that are represented in a given geographic region. And the kinds of processes behind this are primarily processes of cladogenesis, where given languages are splitting into daughter languages. Whether or not those languages are maintained over time is a somewhat secondary consideration. Then we have the diversity of genealogical or genetic units, so language families, that's represented in the lower map. And as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the kinds of distributions, the patterns of distributions between these two kinds of diversity that we see, but it's definitely not exact. And I'll be looking in more detail at the Amazon basin, which you can see is fairly linguistically diverse with perspective of overall number of languages, but far more so from the perspective of number of families. So this difference raises further interesting questions about the processes behind this. So the second kind of family-level linguistic diversity presupposes maintenance over time, but is more agnostic about the role of cladogenesis throughout time. And then finally, we have cross-cutting patterns of disparity, as Nick Evans and other people have referred to it, meaning different kinds of varying typological difference among different linguistic systems. So different kinds of typological variation that may cross-cut these different patterns of diversity with respect to numbers of languages and numbers of families. So the processes of convergence and divergence that are involved in creating these patterns of linguistic diversity have to make reference to language contact. It's probably the key factor behind these processes. Language contact can be relevant at any and all levels of linguistic structure, so from phonology all the way up to discourse. And it's also relevant to processes of both convergence and divergence. And in recent years, so everybody's always known, of course, that language contact is relevant to convergence, but in recent years, work by people like Sally Thomason and Nick Evans, Thurston's work a bit earlier in the Pacific, has pointed out that contact-driven divergence is also very real phenomenon that we need to take into account. And these processes of convergence and divergence with reference to contact, but also potentially without contact involved, are relevant both on the level of the family tree, so the number of trees involved, the number of families, and the internal architecture of the family trees that exist. And clearly they're also relevant on the typological level relating to disparity, greater or lesser patterns of disparity. So some of the factors that are behind convergence and divergence in multilingual contexts, clearly there's a huge range of potential factors. And in fact, just zipping back to map 1 here relating to the diversity of languages, there's been a lot of work in recent years that's investigated possible correlates of linguistic diversity with non-linguistic factors. So amount of rainfall, latitude, demographic density, and so on. But there has been somewhat less work done or somewhat less attention paid in the sort of broader literature on linguistic diversity to the role of sociocultural practices in this process. Of course, in the sociolinguistic literature, this is a more, has been given more attention. But I think it's important here to just think a little bit about, before I get started, just think a little bit about the different factors that may be relevant to processes of convergence and divergence, and the degree to which these may be more or less sensitive to variable sociocultural factors, as opposed to what we might assume would be more universal cognitive principles. So on one hand, we have factors that can be argued to be more cognitive and therefore likely to be more universal, that have to do with essentially balancing, multilingual speakers balancing the load of handling multiple languages, trying to keep them distinct or choosing situations in which they can be merged under certain conditions. On the other hand, we've got a whole range of factors that are more sensitive to sociocultural variability, and these have to do with the kind of discourse practices that are involved, the types of and densities of social network structures involved, and different sorts of perceptions of social solidarity and difference. So, especially with respect to these kinds of socioculturally relevant variables, the way that an individual speaker navigates all of these linguistic choices and the interplay among all of these different factors is, in many respects, in large respects, a social endeavor, which has been classically formulated by LePage and Tabaré-Keller's discussion of acts of identity. So, as they put it, the individual is creating patterns of linguistic behavior to resemble groups from which with which he wishes to be identified or distinguished. But the point that I want to focus on here is that there's considerable room for variability in cultural conceptions of how the social group is understood in relation to others, the degree to which an individual can manipulate his or her group affiliations, and the role that language plays in this process. So we've seen evidence of this sort of variability in, for example, work by James Stanford on dialect interaction among Sui communities in rural China, and we'll see evidence of it in the Amazon basin as well. So from that point, I want to dive more closely into the Amazonian question. So the picture of Amazonian linguistic diversity has raised questions for a long time. There are a lot of rather mysterious aspects of the diversity that we see, the picture of diversity that we see in South America, and particularly in the lowland part of South America known as Amazonia. So most strikingly, there's an unusually high diversity of genetic or genealogical units. So more than 50 distinct language families and isolates. Of these families, the majority of them are quite small, so fewer than 5 members is really typical. Also, South America has a disproportionate percentage of the world's isolates, so 34% of the world total. There are lots and lots of isolates in South America, particularly along that western sub-Andean region of the Amazon basin. So why you get this kind of pattern, why you get the regional patterning within Amazonia is a really intriguing question. In addition to that, of the few large families that exist, they tend to be distributed in a non-contiguous way. So if you compare this, for example, to a map of Eurasia, it's a very, very different picture. The colors on this map, it's a map by Joost Gippert, the colors represent language families. So this just gives you some sense of the diversity that we're looking at in terms of families. And also you can see the red, for example, is Tupi. So one of the shades of purple is Arawakan. You can get a sense for how non-contiguous those family distributions are. So the premise here that I'm building on is that the prevalence of these small, distinct language families implies maintenance of diversity over time, but with relatively little diversification along the way. Of course, the one caveat here that's important is that there's been quite a bit of pruning of trees, presumably, and language loss in the 500 years of European contact. But it still does not appear at all that those processes explain the linguistic picture that we see here and account for the differences that we see between Amazonia and the rest of the world. So two of the major questions that I want to address here are, what's the story with the Amazon basin in particular? Why is there such high genealogical diversity in so many small and fragmented families? And more broadly, what insights does Amazonia give us into processes of convergence and divergence? And in particular, how do these processes that apply in small-scale societies like we see in the Amazon basin, how might those be, in fact, more generalizable, perhaps in ways that we're not as aware of if we focus on processes of convergence and divergence that are happening in more urban, large-scale, quote-unquote, westernized societies. So if you ask a random person on the street, why is the Amazon basin so linguistically diverse, you'll probably get the kind of response, if you get a response at all, that is captured in this, this photograph from Rolling Stone, 2007. Essentially, there's been a long held stereotype in scholarship, in academia, as well as outside it, that the Amazon basin is occupied by, or has pre-contact been occupied by very small groups of indigenous people who are essentially hunters and gatherers who are sort of knocking around in a virgin wilderness. Recent work over the last couple decades has uncovered more and more evidence that this view is completely flawed or highly flawed. So more and more archaeological evidence, for example, has been emerging that there were large centers of demographic density in the Amazon basin. There were considerable evidence of some degree of social stratification, of large-scale integrated polities, of large-scale coordinated social efforts that would involve, that would be necessary to produce things like these raised fields and causeways that are turning up in large areas of the Amazon basin, especially the more deforestation, sort of silver lining on the deforestation problem, that now we're seeing these amazing evidence of all of these earthworks that are emerging once the trees are cut down. So just a quick look through time in terms of thinking about what might have happened historically. One of the puzzles, of course, with South America is that it's the last continent to have been extensively settled by humans. So the degree of diversity that's there, assuming that the archaeological record is largely accurate, all has to be accounted for within a lesser amount of time than we have to account for patterns of diversity in the rest of the world. Of course, there is a lot of discussion emerging now that's trying to push the date of original habitation of South America and the Americas more generally back. But it still appears that the sort of extensive settlement of the Americas, most of the archaeological evidence points to a somewhat later period, even if there were early settlement dates that could have been much earlier. So we're looking at a start date of maybe 13,000 years ago or so for people to really be dispersing. Roger Blench has pointed out that there may have been a trickle-down of pre-existing diversity out of Beringia, the area of land that was exposed by ice, or by the reduction of the sea levels due to ice between Siberia and the New World. And that there may have been a long period of diversification in that region before people started to move down the opening corridors in the Americas. But whether diversity moved down into South America as it came in, or whether a lot of that diversification was due to sort of rapid dispersal of populations, is an open question. But certainly there's a period there that's sort of just above the cap of the comparative method, as we understand it, that would have allowed for a certain amount of diversification to have occurred. Then, as far as the archaeological record goes, we have periods of building of demographic density, building of patterns of intensive interaction, the spread of certain large families, so the few large families that exist, Tupi and Arawak in particular. And then, of course, in the last 500 years, a very different social atmosphere brought in by the European invasion, with a great deal of demographic loss and social upheaval, and clearly some language loss, and more as we go forward. So with that as a kind of starting point, the question is, what can we determine about Amazonian prehistory, given that, from the linguistic perspective, what can linguistics contribute to it, and what can an ethnographic perspective brought together with a linguistic perspective offer us? There's no pre-European historical record beyond the archaeological one, since there was no native writing system in the Americas. So certainly there's an ethnohistorical record that in some cases appears to go back pretty far, and there's an archaeological record, but both of those they need to be developed a lot more. And there's been 500 years of upheaval, so there's been a lot of change. But nevertheless, if we look through the linguistic and ethnographic record of the Amazon basin, we see certain patterns emerging. And one of these in the contemporary or relatively contemporary record is areas that can be described as regional systems. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. These spots on the map are a set of regional systems that can be identified in the literature that exists, with the caveat that the literature in many of these regions and in many areas outside these regions is very thin in many cases. So we often don't have the information that we would need to be able to give a more sort of comprehensive overview of the region, even as it exists today, let alone what it was like 500 years ago. So in order to explain a little bit about what a regional system is like, I think the best understood area of the Amazon basin is from this perspective, is the Valpez region, or the Upper Rio Negro region. So the Upper Rio Negro is actually everything in this map. The Valpez is this, if you can see my cursor, this more sort of linguistically concentrated area that's drained by the Valpez River. And this is the region where I work, and I've done field work primarily on this language, Hoop, and some on this language, Tho, right here. So as you can see, this region is extremely linguistically diverse. It's represented by multiple language families and lots of languages within those families. There's also intensive interaction that goes on among the different groups represented by these languages and ethnicities. So you have a number of different cross-cutting distinctions. Probably the best known characterization of interaction in the region is what is termed linguistic exogamy, so where people obligatorily marry across language lines. So if you identify as Tucano, that means that your father is Tucano and you live in a Tucano village. But if you're a man, you will marry a woman who comes from a different village and identifies with a different father language and marries in. However, you'll grow up with your mother speaking in one language, your father speaking another language, you being pushed towards primarily identifying with your father's language, but developing competence, certainly passive competence, and in most cases some active competence in your mother's language, your aunt's language, the languages of various in-marrying women. So it's very common in this region for speakers to be multilingual in several languages, 5 or 6 languages. This marriage system, linguistic exogamy system, is primarily associated with the East Tucanoan people and with the Tariana within the Arawak group. There's others engage more in clan exogamy within language groups. So there's another distinction here between the people that live in the interfluvial zone, which are the Nadahupan and Kakwanukak language groups, and those who live along the rivers, the East Tucanoan and Arawakan peoples. And they also engage in a great deal of exchange, primarily, in interaction, sort of institutionalized interaction and exchange. And there tends to be unreciprocated bilingualism on the part of the Nadahup and Kakwa people in particular in the languages of their riverine neighbors. So in addition to that, you get generalized interaction in ritual and ceremonial activities. Another interesting aspect of interaction in the region is extensive trade that often involves, in many cases, involves trade specializations, such that different groups of people are primarily manufacturers of particular kinds of items. One interesting component of that practice is that in many cases, it doesn't appear to be motivated primarily by differential access to resources, but more the sense that each of these groups is part of a system and needs to have a sort of distinctive element such that it can engage in the larger system. So just briefly, as far as the structure of the system, there are many striking parallels in cultural and discursive practice that, again, very much cross-cut the linguistic differences that we see and some of the other differences like trade specializations. And then as far as multilingual practices go, it's a highly multilingual region for individual speakers as well as with respect to the region in general. So I mentioned some of the multilingual patterns that go on. But another point is that multilingualism is often passive. So where you have intermarrying spouses in some communities, depending on the community, what is quite normal in the region is to have conversations where one spouse is speaking one language, the other is speaking another language. So bilingual conversations. And in some cases, depending to some degree on the community and the ethnic group and so on, this is just the normal way of going about your business. So a lot of the literature on the region has stressed the prohibitions that exist against language mixing. So remember, everybody's highly multilingual, but if you accidentally slip something into your speech from another language, there's a lot of social condemnation that can go along with that. So work by Sorensen, Jackson, Trinella, Eichenwald, and others has really stressed some of the social condemnation that's involved. Clearly, the picture is complex, and if we look at language practices on the ground, we see a lot of complexity, but some of the general emerging patterns, and certainly in the kind of ideologies that people present, have to do with these prohibitions. Along the same lines, code switching is tightly constrained. There are places where it's okay, so in particular, if you're doing something like quoting the speech of a spirit in a story or something like that, but what you don't virtually never find in this region, very, 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 very rarely at least, is intrasentential code switching, where people are mixing languages within the same clause or the same sentence. So what are the linguistic outcomes? A lot of the aspects of the linguistic outcomes of this context situation challenge some of the generalizations that we might assume from reading the literature on language contact in more urban settings. So in spite of the intensity of the contact that's going on, we have very limited lexical borrowing. Where lexical borrowing occurs, in some cases where we've had studies that have looked at this in up close, we actually find more verbs than nouns. So really typologically sort of turned on its head. This is just one example of a sentence in Hoop where there's a Tucano loan. And along this, at the same time, we have heavy diffusion in grammatical structures and categories. So Alexander Eichenwald has looked in depth at the grammatical diffusion that's taken place in Teriana through Tucanoan influence. I've done some work with the same sorts of effects in Hoop, and my colleague Catherine Bolaños, who I should have cited here, sorry, has also looked at some of these effects in Kakwa, so a third language, representative of a third language family in the region, or a fourth if you count Tucanoan. So these two sentences here just give you some idea of the kind of what appears to be essentially phrasal calking that's gone on. Another way of assessing the kinds of diffusion effects here have to do with comparing the related languages that are spoken within the region, so like these two Nada-Hoop languages, Hoop and Yuhoop, to those spoken outside the region, like Do and Nadeb. So Eichenwald has done this looking at Teriana and its close sister Baniwa, spoken outside the region, and evidentials, which are grammaticalized indicators of information source, where your information is coming from, are a good example of the kind of restructuring of a whole grammatical category to fit, as you can see, these Valpez categories, these Valpez norms, where you have up to 5 different categories of information source, where outside the region you typically only have one marked distinction. Well, 2 distinctions, one of which gets marked. And I don't have time to go into it now, but if you look at you can trace, so for example, in Yuhoop, you can trace the grammaticalization of these morphemes from language internal elements, such as, for example, the non-visual evidential coming from the verb meaning to make noise. And you can trace this whole grammaticalization pathway and establish very clearly that this is indeed a metamorphosis of the filling out of a category to fit an areal model, but using resources that are language internal. So in other words, they're restructuring their grammars to look very much like those of the other languages in the region, but not borrowing the actual forms of the morphemes. So that's the Valpez region in a nutshell. But if we look more widely at these other regional systems, we actually see some very similar patterns. And this is somewhat striking because since the Valpez region has gotten more attention in the literature, for a long time it was promoted as this very exotic, very unique situation. But I would argue that, in fact, this is a lot of the patterns that we see in the Valpez are more broadly South American or lowland South American. So all of these regions that I've selected here, which in fact include the Gran Chaco, which technically is outside the Amazon basin, have localized linguistic diversity with multiple families. They have evidence of frequent interaction among different linguistic and ethnic units, including in many cases trade specializations, much like what we saw for the Valpez, and relative cultural homogeneity in spite of the linguistic distinctions. One analogy that I think is very nice in understanding how these systems work is something like gears in a machine, where each of the gears has to have a certain distinction from the others, but they all fit together and work to make a kind of integrated whole. So in these regional systems, we have a number of comparable sociolinguistic practices that we seem to find evidence for over and over. Lots of multilingualism, especially in ritual contexts. Again, with the degree to which individuals are multilingual varies from place to place, but particularly in ritual contexts, you find a lot. Frequent passive multilingualism, language being really highlighted in the ethnographic accounts as an emblem of difference among the groups involved, and other examples of what's essentially linguistic exogamy cropping up, and many more examples of frequent intermarriage among linguistic units. So just a couple of quotes to sort of illustrate that. And as far as the linguistic effects go, we get widespread observations of limited lexical borrowing coupled with varying degrees of evidence of diffusion in grammatical structures and categories. Now here a big caveat is that we need a lot more work on these languages and regions, pretty much across the board, to be able to really establish the extent to which grammatical diffusion has gone on in all of them. But there's clearly evidence for some in many cases, and in some cases, what appears to have been quite a bit. But pretty much across the board, people who have looked at the languages in these regions remark that lexical borrowing is fairly low. So some questions with respect to the Amazonian situation. To what extent do these regional systems, or the patterns that we see recurring in these systems, represent more widespread tendencies in lowland South America? And to what extent is linguistic diversity coupled with interaction? So as opposed to being an outcome of isolation of populations, to what extent can it in fact be understood as an outcome of a particular kind of interaction and contact? And another question that I won't have time to get into here in any detail, but I think is really interesting, is to what extent are the Amazonian linguistic ecologies that we see here culturally grounded? So if we look back at the historical and archaeological record, there is evidence for continuity in space. We have reconstruction of trade routes in the archaeological record, such as in this map on the left. We have other kinds of evidence for large-scale knowledge, or knowledge of large-scale systems of waterways. So both of these maps represent, like essentially whole quadrants of South America. These are really large regions. This is the northwest quadrant here on the left, and the northeast quadrant here on the right. The northeast quadrant is the area that's represented in Arawakan ritual discourse. So there's a whole topographic record that's encountered in their ritual discourse that indicates a historical knowledge of a very, very large region. As for continuity over time, this is a very, very difficult question, but there is some archaeological evidence to suggest that these sorts of regional systems were widespread in the past as they are now. So work by Denise Gomez, for example, in polities like Santoreng, and Heckenberger's work in the Xingu suggest these very large integrated kind of linked systems of peoples that in many cases appear to have had some ethnic distinctions, and we can guess that perhaps there were linguistic distinctions there as well. If we look beyond the linguistic level, there's also plenty of evidence for large-scale exchange in material culture and technology, also in discourse and ritual culture. So this map here shows the distribution of sacred flute cults throughout the Amazon basin. So what about the cultural grounding? This is something I wish I had more time to get into because I think it's really fascinating, but the ethnographic record is very clear. The ethnographic literature throughout the Amazon basin is very clear about the importance of what is referred to as alterity, so the idea that social groups are defined in relation to other groups. And moreover, that one's identity as belonging to a particular social group has to be actively maintained, and that speaking, as well as other things like dressing and eating, are some of the sort of critical ways in which you maintain your membership in a given social group. So I want to turn now to the linguistic evidence. So what I want to do here is look at the results of a large-scale survey that I've been engaged in over the last few years to investigate the scale and scope of language contact in focusing on the northern Amazon basin. So looking at lexical borrowing, looking at grammatical diffusion, and thinking about other processes of language convergence and divergence that may have gone on. So if the linguistic ecologies that we see in these regional systems reflect trends that once were more widespread, then we could expect languages throughout the region to show evidence of contact, but also to show the maintenance of linguistic diversity. And certainly we see a lot of linguistic diversity, but evidence for the maintenance of it might have to do with things like low lexical borrowing that people are more conscious of in their monitoring of linguistic distinctions, like we see in these regional systems. So these are the languages that that I've investigated in the course of the survey. Some 90 languages from 32 families. The data is all available online. So I want to start with a discussion of the results from the loanword survey. One of the problems in assessing the statements in the literature relating to the degree of lexical borrowing that's taken place is that there's not been a systematic survey. These are just kind of impressions of people working in different regions at different times. So in this study, we undertook a controlled comparison across standardized lists of basic vocabulary, flora, fauna, and culture terms. And this is work that's been, that I've been building on since initiating work with Claire Bowern and Jane Hill and others a few years ago. So the methodology we used was evaluating each term in the database against all the others that had the same or related meaning, and applying essentially the comparative method to determine whether the word in that given language was a likely loan, or what its linguistic history has been. Again, with the caveat that most of these language families do not have detailed historical work. So this work was building on what work exists and then was using, applying the comparative method within the database itself to the extent that was possible. An example of how this was done, so here's Nadahupan languages compared to, some words in Nadahupan languages compared to Tucanoan and Arawakan. And of course, we could expand this table to compare these Tucano words with all of the Tucanoan sister languages and the Baniwa words with the Arawakan sister languages, and get some sense of which language families these words were likely to actually be cognated and which language families they appear to have been borrowed into. In all of these cases, the Nadahupan words appear to be loans from either Tucano or Baniwa. This is a schematization of the results for the Nadahupan family specifically, but this has been done for many of the other families as well, or all of the ones that were considered in the northern Amazon. And you can see here the different languages of the family have different degrees of different percentages of loans representing the different fields of basic vocabulary, flora, fauna, and culture terms. But the general pattern here is that basic vocabulary loans are particularly low. The others are somewhat higher. We can also identify the sources of the loans, again, with some fuzziness in some cases, but in many cases, it's fairly clear. So here in Hupdo and Nadab, these are three Nadahupan languages. We have loans coming from different neighboring language families, as well as some European loans. This graph simply shows the average results across all of the languages in the sample. So again, a fairly coherent pattern where basic vocabulary is low and flora, fauna, and culture terms are somewhat higher. Here we see the results across all of the language families represented in the sample. So again, you can appreciate that there's some variation across language families depending on a number of different factors. These factors have mostly to do with sort of who's where in different historical periods of time in different geographic regions. But interestingly, subsistence pattern doesn't seem to be relevant to the amount of lexical borrowing that's taken place, although it does seem to be relevant to directionality in that the languages that are more on the hunter-gathering end of the spectrum do seem to be taking in loans and not giving them very much. And then we can also look at the results across the individual languages of the ones that have been specifically investigated for this study. And again, you can see a lot of variability, but a general overall pattern. So one of the interesting things that comes out when we look at the donor language families is that overall, the language families that appear to be big donors are those language families that have spread out in the Amazon basin. So presumably, some of the factors that were relevant to their spreading out and moving across space and diversifying through that process may have also been relevant to their donating or offering their lexical items to other languages. Arawakan in particular is understood in the ethnohistorical literature as having had a pretty major role in ritual and cosmological life, or pretty major influence in ritual and cosmological life throughout the Amazon basin. So that may be part of its importance here as well. So this diagram comes from joint work with Claire Bowern, where we compared lexical borrowing levels in basic vocabulary with other parts of the world. So the striking point here is that South America seems to be quite low with respect to overall numbers of lexical borrowing. Again, this is northern Amazonia principally, but with respect to overall levels of lexical borrowing. So quite low in relation to other areas of the world that were investigated. We've also looked at Wanderwörter, which are important indications of possible networks of interaction and contact that might have taken place over a large area. So these are, Wanderwörter, of course, are superloans that are spread out across a wide set of languages. We applied certain criteria for their identification. And this, again, is work that began with Claire Bauern, Hannah Haney, and others in a more large-scale comparative project, and then I've been continuing this within the South American context. These are just an example of some of the Wanderwörter that we turned up. The percentage sign is just a symbol that indicates a kind of standardized etymon that is relevant to all the languages that it appears in, much like the asterisk for reconstruction. So overall results, I'm going to move a little bit faster in the interest of time. But here we can just see some of the distributions, just some sample distributions of Wanderwörter that give you a sense of the kinds of networks of interaction that must have pertained in the northern Amazon, and help us to understand both the relevance of these regional systems with respect to lexical borrowing over time, but also much more widespread networks of contact. So here's two Wanderwörter in the upper Rio Negro region. Here's some distributions in the Caquetá Putumayo. Here's somewhat more widely, looking at the northern sub-Andes. Even more widely, some Wanderwörter represent distributions across the Orinoco and Guianas region, much broader throughout northern South America. And in many cases, we can identify that a particular language family had a particular role as a vehicle of spread, in some cases identifiable as an origin point. Here again, the scope gets wider. And for a few Wanderwörter, we were able to identify really wide distributions, even pan-Amazonian. So in this case, the data collection in the southern region was very targeted to a few regions. So if we were able to undertake an even broader survey of the languages there, we might in fact find even wider distributions for these Wanderwörter. Another example of a widely distributed feature is what my co-author Cynthia Hansen and I have called relational numeral terms. So these are this very intriguing, what appears to be a kind of calque that appears across many, many language families all over the Amazon basin, principally for the number 4, that means something like has a companion or has a sibling. So really widely represented. So I'm going to just summarize quickly what we see in the loanword patterns here. Basic vocabulary rates are low. Flora and fauna and culture rates are somewhat higher, but there's still nothing, no higher and somewhat lower, in fact, compared to other regions of the world. Wanderwörter give evidence for pretty extensive interactive networks. And these dispersed families, such as Arawakan and Tupian, appear to be, have had a role as major donors. So I want to quickly talk a little bit about the evidence for grammatical diffusion. So remember, in the regional systems, we saw low lexical borrowing, but much more significant grammatical diffusion. So the question is, how widespread is that? And how can we tell, given that we don't have the luxury of, and for most of the Amazon basin, we don't have the luxury that we have in the Valpes of being able to compare. Remember, there's so many small language families. In many cases, we can't compare related languages that are within a given context zone and those outside it, because there's only 1 or 2 languages in the family. And in many cases, we also just don't have the level of documentation or historical work that we need to really give a kind of robust account of context-driven grammatical change. So in order to get around this, at least temporarily, I conducted a survey of grammatical features and used the NeighborNet algorithm as an assessment of similarity across languages on the basis of these 200-something grammatical features. So the idea here is basically that if you use a NeighborNet algorithm to assess overall similarity among these sets of grammatical features across these languages, you can consider groupings by family, which is what you would expect in sort of normal patterns of inheritance, and you can inspect groupings by region, which is what you expect in situations of contact, and see where one trumps the other. And that can give some information about contact-driven change. So this is the total number of languages considered. And here are some of the results. So if we look at the large circles represent geographic regions, and the squares represent language families. So here, if you look closely, this red square represents Arawakan languages, and you can see that the Arawakan languages here are separated from those that are located in the Caquetá-Putumayo region and from Tariana, which is located in the Valpez region. So the family is the structure of the family is being torn apart on the level of typological features, and the languages are grouping with the region and not with the family. So here's another similar sort of schematization, which is probably most revealing if we look at it with respect to how the languages are placed on the map geographically. And here you can see that the clusterings that are represented in the split tree diagram are consistent with the geographic distribution of these languages in space. And at the same time, you get some of the same sorts of trumpings of language family groupings that we saw. So, for example, these red languages are Naudahop languages. They're appearing, one is over here, and the other two are over here in the split tree diagram. So they're grouping with their neighbors with respect to their grammatical profiles rather than with their sisters. I'm going to skip this one. So just to sum up here, what I've talked about is that the picture of contact and linguistic diversity that we see in the Amazon basin has to do with, it seems to be a case where there's evidence for frequent contact both between language groups and within language groups, associated with a kind of linguistic ideology that associates a particular view of alterity and group identity. And this seems to be part of what has led to the linguistic picture that we get, where you have an active maintenance of existing linguistic distinctions, but the limited development of newer ones. So in addition to the kinds of linguistic effects that we've seen, there's little evidence for adoption of regional lingua francas. There's little evidence of language shift without an entire shift of ethnic identity, which is very difficult to trace, but there does seem to be some account of that happening, but virtually no accounts of shift of language where the ethnic identity is maintained within the indigenous context. And I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about what's happened in the past 500 years, which is very different. And then finally, in particular, limited language internal diversification. So what it seems to have been involved an ongoing homogenization within groups of people that identify as speaking the same language. So if we compare this to what's happened in the last 500 years with indigenous colonial contexts, we have quite different dynamics. So here we do have the adoption of lingua francas, which in some cases are indigenous languages, but they're indigenous languages that are European motivated or mediated. So they're sort of intermediaries between the European presence and the indigenous presence. Lots of language shift. And in some cases, the development of lingua francas, whether they're European languages or, as I mentioned, these other indigenous languages, you get lots of code switching. So even in the Valpez, where speakers, for example, of Tucanoan languages, are not code switching among the indigenous languages they command, they will readily code switch intersententially between, say, Tucano and Portuguese, for example. And very different patterns of lexical borrowing versus grammatical diffusion. So different linguistic ecologies seem to have very different contact outcomes. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this last section, but what I had in mind here is to talk a little bit in a broader comparative view and think about how the Amazon basin relates to other parts of the world. So I'll just very briefly touch on this. Enfield 2003 has what I think is a very useful diagram of how the individual, the kinds of contact relationships that can pertain between a person and, as he puts it, a linguistic signifier. So how the individual conceptualizes the idea of language and group and how the different ways that those can go together. So if we look at some of these regions like Amazonia and think about what kinds of associations between language and group might be emphasized in this regional context, clearly they're all relevant on some level, but which ones might be sort of particularly emphasized? We can schematize them in a way that's brought up by this diagram. So for example, in indigenous Amazonia, we could argue that there's a particular connection between an association of this language and people like me, and another language and people not like me, which could lead to maintenance of distinctions with relatively little diversification. We can compare that, I won't get into all of these regions, but we can compare it, for example, to northern Vanuatu, where the languages are virtually all Austronesian for the most part, but there's been rapid evidence of diversification. And Alexandre François has written about this at some length and talked about how basically innovations will get started and will sort of roll to the limit of where people perceive a particular social boundary, and then they'll pile up there, and that will lead to diversification. So we could schematize this sort of situation as an association between this language and people like me, and a language that's a little bit different and people who are not so much like me. So I'm going to skip through the next couple ones, but the idea is that you can apply this kind of reasoning. So what sorts of connections between group and language are emphasized in different sorts of multilingual situations around the world? And it seems that in many cases, these small-scale societies have something in common. They have, in many cases, they have a kind of move towards linguistic diversity or a maintenance of existing linguistic diversity, but the particular cultural and social ways that plays out may be variable. And in some cases, that can have to do with whether the processes of diversification are rapid cladogenesis or whether they're just maintenance of distinctions, which, again, as I mentioned, are really quite different processes. And of course, contemporary conditions of language endangerment and shift with European colonial presence are a different kind of situation again. So to wrap up, first, going back to Amazonia, do we have an explanation for Amazonia's linguistic profile? Well, clearly the explanation is very complex, and I've only touched on a small part of it. But one way of thinking about it is that you would have had an early stage of diversification or maybe some influx of existing diversity from Beringia that would have put set the stage for diversity just beyond what we're able to determine via the comparative method. Then what appears to have happened is a long-term period of maintenance with limited further cladogenesis that, as I've argued, would have been facilitated by contact. And that much of the diversification that did take place in some of these larger families like Arawakan would in fact have been facilitated by the isolation of the speakers as they've migrated or their influence migrated to different areas. So finally, to conclude, I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of variability in contact-driven convergence and divergence across regions and across periods of human history. And that to really understand what's going on, I think it's important to make reference to the culturally specific understandings of language and identity that may be variable from one cultural context to the next. Also, network density and scope are relevant, so clearly non-linguistic factors like historical events and ecosystem capacity are important. And the prior linguistic landscape, so what human migrations patterns were involved. And so finally, in the interest of, in the spirit of the panel on endangered languages that's coming up on Thursday, I just want to point out that a robust understanding of patterns of language contact and change requires us to bring together linguistic and ethnographic and historical perspectives and to do so over a wide range of languages and regions and try to really diversify our approach to match the kind of diversity that we see in the world. So, thank you. So I assume we have a few minutes for questions, but maybe Bridget will clarify, or Marianne. Okay, yeah, sorry, not very much time, but. Hi.
I was just wondering, you're talking about maintenance of diversity, but we also know that there was a lot of fusion of different groups, and there was ethnogenesis of new groups as a result of these upheavals brought about by colonization. Right? So if we're looking at the Orinoco inventory, many groups disappeared, but they disappeared from that historical record because they migrated to regions that were occupied by other groups and were integrated into those other groups. So I was wondering if you could say something about loss of diversity that way and what the structural changes is to the languages that adopted these new speakers to have been.
Yeah, so I think your point is really important because a lot of my discussion is sort of focusing on what I think would have been the pattern pre-contact, in pre-contact times, but clearly the last 500 years has brought about tremendous change. And it's very difficult to look beyond that, obviously, since all we really have to go on is the contemporary picture. But yeah, certainly there has been the assimilation of speakers into existing groups when often because their community, they underwent demographic collapse and they had to basically merge with other communities to survive. And my understanding, and I know you've looked at this, is that in some cases they've actually maintained their linguistic and ethnic identity for some period of time before assimilating more completely. I don't want to deny the existence of all of that complexity, but what I do see is a sort of a general pattern in cases where the merging isn't brought about by complete demographic collapse, like in these what we might call sort of special cases, is that where you do have accounts of so-called ethnogenesis, where a group of people switch their ethnic and linguistic identity, what you don't seem to get is what you find nowadays, for example, where people will still identify, for example, as Baré, but just speak Portuguese. But what you do seem to find in the historical record, at least, is evidence of groups that just decided, for whatever happened to make them do this, underwent a transition to become Arawakan, for example, and gave up their linguistic identity and their ethnic identity at the same time and assimilated completely. So what's happening in these contexts of demographic collapse where you have a few speakers merging with other villages, maybe some combination of those two sorts of phenomena. But it's definitely something that needs a lot more attention, and we really need more studies looking at all of these kinds of effects on a sociolinguistic and ethnographic and historical linguistic level.
Probably have time for the briefest of another question, and then we'll have a coffee break. Did Hudson?
Throughout your talk, I kept thinking how informative it would be to have an account like that about Africa. And I'm very grateful that you included a brief comparison, because many of the things that you described would apply to African communities too, owing to the nature of the egalitarian relationships that have existed among neighboring groups, and the attitude as kind of courtesy that you learn the language of the other people you have to shift with. And when you got to where you describe the shift to the European languages, and that's where Africa and South America have come in.
Uh-huh.
And that's due to differences in styles of colonization and settlement colonization versus exploitation colonization. And settlement colonization has exerted much more pressure, I think, on indigenous people after eroding the sustainability of the traditional economies to shift to the European language and in Africa. And this is probably one of the cases where you can also say slow economic development in modern terms,
Uh-huh.
sustained linguistic diversity. differences between, say, North America, where settlement colonization has spread more rapidly, than South America, where, at least maybe because of the density of the rainforest, the encroachment on territories of Native Americans has been slow.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Your work on linguistic ecologies, I think, is very important in sort of thinking about these different processes and how they pertain at different historical periods in different parts of the world, and how there's really a very complex set of historical and cultural and social factors that go into that. And certainly the situation in Africa is really interesting to compare. I won't go on at any length, but I just will make one further comment, which is that I think that some of what appears really exotic about the Amazon basin probably isn't all that exotic. It's probably a more sort of default, in some ways maybe even a kind of default scenario for small-scale societies in many parts of the world, with little differences of flavor like we see in Cameroon and Northern Australia and Vanuatu, that in some cases appear to be big differences, whether depending on the prior linguistic landscape and other factors involved and other kinds of sort of ecological factors. But that in small-scale societies, it may be that a kind of linguistic diversity with multilingualism is kind of the norm. But then, of course, when you get the European colonial presence, you get what Guy Bailey referred to as this catastrophic sort of situation where you get radical changes, but that are sensitive, of course, to the different kinds of ecologies brought in by those historical events. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.
So we'll meet back here, those of you that will be coming back to this room, at 10:45, coffee break. Oh. Yes, we'll keep him here. I guess we, oh, wasn't that beautiful? Oh, wasn't that wonderful? I get it, we should have. Just sort of true. Yeah, that decision has to be made. Yes. Yeah, no, it worked well.
Okay, and so I have a
PowerPoint,
PowerPoint,
yeah.
yeah. Because sometimes I'm the systems are not
Gotcha.
also in PDF for
Oh, an older PowerPoint and then PDF.
right.
Okay, so we'll use it. I think the new one will be good. That's great that you're prepared for that. Can we try it really quick? Okay.
Yeah, let's just see one more where we have an example of Spanish. Yeah, for instance.
Okay.
No.
All right. Great. So it'll be here on the desktop.
Okay, and to get the full screen, what will I have to push?
Right. So if you open it up and you just do slideshow here,
Slideshow.
and then begin from beginning. That'll
And with this
left
I
and right.
move
Left and
left
right.
and right.
Okay. Good. All right.
And now comes mine.
All
And
right.
I'm the first to speak this morning.
Let me get your USB back. Thank you guys for coming early.
Oh, well, I actually sent my presentation
Okay.
by email.
Very early. All right, it's San Antonio.language. Okay, I'm going to put it on desktop. All right. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, just pull it. So this is you. This is number 2 here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am the first one I see.
Yeah. Okay. So we can do it after everything wraps up today or lunch. Really? Whatever works best for you. You can just come on down to our table back here. Great. Thank you.
So a couple people.
I'm depending on them to find their presentation.
Gentlemen, when you have a little time, I need to ask you a question.
Okay.
You are?
I'm Doug.
Supposed to be, you know, statement, good things.
Okay.
I think you are right at the 265, where it says, the signal is not good. And I want you to test it first.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to do it.
You want to come on up here and we can go ahead and try it out? Okay.
It's voice and
This one?
yeah, the right. That's the whistle.
Okay, I'm going to put it over here on the desktop. Try it out.
Thank you so much. for
Sure,
coming.
sure.
That's it. That's it.
Yo le pregunté a mi abuelo que
It's not coming up yet. Oh, this cable keeps coming out. We got to work on that. That was the problem. All right, now. Okay,
Perfect. That's
great.
Probably about 2 or 3 minutes, but so you leave it there and
Yeah,
and
if
whenever
you know, can you come find it here? It's right here on the desktop.
So and how do I control?
You can use this right here. So try that. Yep, and then double click. Use this one here, this red one. Great. And then you can hit this over here. That'll make it full screen. Yeah. So then.
Yo le pregunté a mi abuelo
And then up here the X will close it. Okay?
I hope you're
If you need any help, let us know. We'll jump up here and take
Every
it.
time Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Hi. Yes.
briefly just for the introductions. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. Will you be our tech contact if there are any emergencies as people get set up?
For today, I will be.
Okay, wonderful.
I'm training my team.
Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Oh, sure. I won't be plugging it in. I'm just going to be chatting using some notes, so I don't forget anything.
I'm loving what you're saying. I'm enjoying it.
I think pretty soon. Yeah, it looks like a few more people are filtering in. We're going to give everybody a moment to have coffee and use the bathroom.
Okay. Like a wireless one?
I'm just going to give a little introduction about 15, 20 minutes.
Right. For sure.
That is a great idea. Maybe at the beginning of the lunch break. Okay, or if I finish up early, how much can really use that in the introductions? You can always do it before we get started too. I understand. Yeah, completely.
Out of your way.
Oh, sure.
Organizing here so we can't stop stalling out.
Yes, exactly. So it'll be about 20 minutes and then 5 minutes for questions. Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Yes, okay. Thank you very much. It looks like most people are starting to get situated, so I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to San Antonio, to the 23rd iteration of ITCHL, and more specifically, to the very exciting panel on Spanish socio-historical linguistics, isolation, and contact. We're delighted to have you here with us. We have a fascinating lineup of speakers today, and it's been the brainchild of Dr. Bridget Drinka, who's done a wonderful job organizing, and the rest of the organizing committee. So I'm Dr. Whitney Chappell from UT San Antonio, and the other members of the organizing committee include Yasmin Bil-Ribaya and Matthew Juge, who are both associate professors of linguistics from Texas State University, and of course, Bridget Drinka. I wanted to mention a few things before we get started with this panel at 11:15. This panel in particular kicks off the San Antonio Tricentennial Celebration. And in case you don't know much about the Tricentennial Celebration, it involves an entire year of events, activities, festivals to usher in the next 300 years of San Antonio and celebrate the past 300 years. So obviously Spanish plays a pivotal role in the history of San Antonio, so this is a wonderful event to have kicking off the Tricentennial Celebration. In these introductory remarks, I'd like to thank some of our partners, some of our sponsors, and also just provide a general introduction to what you can expect for the rest of the day. So first, I'd like to give special recognition to some of our important partners, including the Honorable Enrique Panes Calpe, who is a Cónsul General de España, Mónica del Arenal, who's with the Mexican Cultural Institute, and Leslie Palmer of the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. We also have a wonderful list of sponsors who've made this event possible. Without their help, we wouldn't have been able to bring in our panelists and keynote speakers. So we'd like to thank Katy Moreno, Sidney Chocron, and Dr. and Mrs. Arturo Molina from the Casa de España, Dr. Francisco Chiscano. We have several different departments of UTSA that have contributed as well. So UTSA's Office of International Programs, the Dean of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts, the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, the Department of Bicultural Bilingual Studies, the Faculty of English as a Second Language. UT Austin has also generously contributed to this panel. We have the Department of Linguistics, their University Center for the Study of the Southwest, and Texas State has helped quite a bit as well. So we have Texas State University's Department of Modern Languages and Texas A&M University College Station's Department of Hispanic Studies. And last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our student workers and student volunteers who have generously offered to pick up our panelists. In particular, Kat Weigel and Gabriela Limos, who have done a wonderful job being in touch with all of the participants, organizing the website. They've really done a superb job. And of course, Bridget Drinka, who has put an exorbitant amount of time and effort into organizing this conference. I think you'll see throughout the week all of the different panels, the sessions, the activities we have planned, the incredible amount of effort that has gone into this endeavor. So thank you to Bridget for all of the hard work that she's done organizing. So now I'd like to introduce the incredible panelists that will be presenting and just provide a sketch of what to expect for the rest of the day. So starting at 11:15, we'll be hearing from María Ángeles Gallego García from the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas from Madrid. And she'll be talking about From Contact to Isolation, the evolution of romance in Al-Andalus. She has a PhD in Semitic philology from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and she's the deputy director of the Institute of Languages and Cultures of the Mediterranean and the Near East in Madrid, also a tenured researcher with the Institute of Languages and Cultures in the Spanish High Council for Scientific Research. Her research focuses on medieval Judeo-Arabic language and literature, history and culture of the Jews in medieval Iberia, the history of linguistic ideas in the Semitic world, the history and culture of the Jews of Islam in Spain, and sociolinguistics, of course. So she'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for questions following her presentation. Starting at 11:45, we'll be hearing from Álvaro Octavio de Toledo y Huerta, who's at the University of München, and he will be speaking on historical syntax, needs, dialectology, lessons from Spanish. So that's another very interesting presentation we're looking forward to. He earned his PhD from the Eberhard Karls University of Tübingen, and he specializes in historical linguistics, in particular relational locatives in Spanish. So those are our 2 morning presentations. Both will be about 20 minutes with 5 to 10 minutes for questions, and after that we have our lunch break. Following the lunch break, we'll be hearing at 1:30 from Malte Rosemeyer from KU Leuven, on the expression of subject pronouns in Spanish and Portuguese WH interrogatives. Dr. Malte Rosemeyer is currently working as an FWO-funded postdoc at KU Leuven in Belgium on the development of interrogatives in Spanish and Portuguese. His research interests include historical corpus linguistics, usage-based linguistics, and semantic and pragmatic theory. Again, that'll be a 20-minute presentation, 5 to 10 minutes for questions. After that, we have a joint presentation from Chantal Melis and Marcela Flores, who are both at UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and they will be discussing transmission, contact, leveling, and innovation, a historical perspective on the accusative, dative opposition in Spanish. So Chantal Melis earned her doctorate at the University of Minnesota. She's a faculty member at UNAM in Mexico. She studies diachronic and synchronic linguistics, specializing in the historical evolution of Spanish syntax, the syntax-semantics interface, and predicative structures. Marcela Flores, who is her joint presenter, holds her PhD from UNAM, and is a professor in the Department of Filosofía y Letras, and is an investigator at the Institute of Philological Investigations. Her research focuses on the history of variation affecting nuclear relations of Spanish syntax, in particular direct and indirect objects. Next at 2:30, and thanks for bearing with me, I know this is a long sketch. At 2:30, we have a presentation from Maria Irene Moina from Texas A&M, which is called Out of the Mouths of Babes, Solving Some Puzzles in Latin American Spanish Variation and Change. Maria Irene Moina holds her PhD in linguistics from the University of Florida. Before working at Texas A&M, she was an assistant professor at San Diego State University. Her main research interests lie in the relationship between society, cognition, and acquisition as factors behind language change. At that point, at about 2:55, we'll have a coffee break. And I'd like to encourage you at 2:55, if you're interested, most enthusiastically, to attend the presentation of a short film called El Silbo, which will be introduced by Dr. Francisco Chiscano. It will introduce the whistled register of Spanish that's spoken in the Canary Islands, used to communicate across mountains and deep ravines. So if you're interested in seeing that, it will start at about 2:55. And obviously, the Canary Islands play a very important role in the history and development of San Antonio, seeing as Canary Islanders were some of the first families to populate the city. Following the coffee break, we have another presentation from Sandro Cesarrego from UT Austin. He will be talking about on the nature of slavery in the Americas and its linguistic consequences, the legal hypothesis of Creole genesis. So Dr. Cesarrego holds his PhD from The Ohio State University, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. He works primarily in the fields of contact linguistics, sociolinguistics, and syntax. More specifically, he works on the linguistic study of the Afro-Hispanic languages of the Americas and the socio-historical analysis of their evolution. Now that will be our last short presentation of 20 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion led by Reina Torres Cacuyos from Penn State for about an hour. And after that, we'll have our closing plenary lecture on synchrony and diachrony, reconsidering convergence. I'm sure you'll hear more about Dr. Reina Torres Cacuyos in a bit, but she hails from the University of New Mexico, where she got her PhD, and she's a professor of linguistics at Penn State University, and she focuses on language contact, language change, and language typology. Those are all of my remarks for now. I simply wanted to provide a little outline of what we're doing today. The panel will officially begin in about 15 minutes for Dr. Gallego Garcia's talk. If Dr. Drinka would like to add anything, I'd love to welcome her up to add anything. If not,
Okay, of course.
okay, wonderful.
I just wanted to, to position this panel, is a matter of pride for us in the tricentennial celebration that I mentioned earlier. So just briefly to say, we want to recognize that historical role that Spanish has played within our city's history. And so, that's why this is chosen as the first up. This is why we're focusing first upon this. And so I don't have any extensive comments to say, but just to say, please be watching throughout the week as we continue this celebration, that we initiate right now today. That's all for me. So we can take a brief break, and we'll be convening then to hear from Maria Angeles at 10:15. 11:15. I've lost track of the hours. 11:15.
She's already done.
Okay. Thank you.
What it looks like for all the panelists, I'll be given 5 minutes and stop. And perfect, we have time to make sure that the PowerPoint will work right now. I'm really looking forward to your talk later.
Ta-da! Well, that's scary.
Here, let
Okay,
me
okay.
slide
So
these off
what,
to the side so they're not.
why is it like? Oh, it's funny. I'm not used to this. I'm not used to PCs anymore. Okay, and is this? Okay. Sorry. Oh, look, it has a nice look to it, right? What's going on? Okay. Anyway.
It's not a Mac.
But what does it look like a Mac?
A Lenovo.
No, it's like the little things look like. Okay. Oh, here.
It always is.
No, they
Oh,
have
the
these-
two-step identity.
Yes. You have this too?
No one will steal your identity.
I don't think that it does any good. I've had my card stolen since this, so I mean, not that it has anything to do with that.
I believe it does because the video. I'll ask Dr. Chisano to be sure, but I believe it does because it's in Spanish, and I believe there are English subtitles. So I think that should work out well. Sure.
I think it's a very old Internet Explorer we're using here. I think you
recent?
downloaded it.
It did? Okay, because I never saw it.
Nope. Try it again.
Okay. Now down, correct? Do you want to open save? I want to save. That's completed. Okay.
Let's move it out of
Yes.
the download.
And into the desktop. Yeah. And then if you don't mind me having a look at it to see whether
Absolutely.
things look like they're supposed to.
Oh, it crashed.
Oh, just sorry.
Works out all of its bugs now.
Yeah, I don't want to mess it up for somebody else.
Let's just try it again. No.
Why?
I don't know. Let's keep it in downloads. It'll be fine.
Or we can open it and save it again. That would work
Let's,
too.
can we sign out of here so that nobody else is using your drive?
Yes. So, but it is somewhere.
It's here. Yep. And sign out.
Is there something about the properties of the presentation itself?
I don't know. This is not my computer. Can I log out here?
Absolutely. Yes.
All right. So it's in the downloads. Maybe we can just play it from the download. Or we could try to drag it.
Yeah.
That worked. All right.
So that works. So it's there. Okay, can we open it? Make sure it doesn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I just want to know what it looks like.
Go ahead and try
Oh, it
doing
doesn't. Let's see. Did it hide the ones that are supposed to be hidden? No. I had some that were hidden. You know how?
Try doing the slideshow. Maybe it will show them in the slideshow.
Nope, it shows them. That's okay. I'll just keep moving. I guess not everything transmits as well.
It's there. Okay.
Okay. It's okay though?
It's
Sorry,
as good as it will
got some
get. No,
extra.
it's okay. No, I'll just tell people he shouldn't be here.
Are you on next? Okay. Which,
wanna make sure.
which one are you? What's your name? Okay. Okay. I think we're fine. Do you have any? You don't have any audio when you're playing. Okay. What would you? Okay. Thank you.
We'll have to see if our first presenter needs anything to be set up. Does she already have her stuff?
Is it this one? No, it should be this one, right?
That one?
I think this is hers.
Yes, that looks promising. Okay, perfect. Yes.
I'm just gonna go ahead and get started here.
Perfect.
She can walk up and be ready to go.
And it'll introduce people nicely as they come in.
Better get ready.
Is this it, Sarah?
Yes.
We just opened up your presentation. I hope that's okay.
Thank you. Thank
Sure,
you.
sure.
Sure.
We've got a few minutes if you want
Okay.
relax.
That's not the case. It's good of you.
Y si quieres, te puedo dar la señal de 5 minutos y ya.
De todos modos lo tengo contado, ya he quitado una parte.
Perfecto, me imagino que así es, pero por si las moscas.
Si tú me das...
Tengo mis rótulos.
No, a mí me da mucha rabia cuando la gente empieza a hablar y hablar y no se puede colgar. O sea, que no te preocupes porque es un gesto de egocentrismo académico.
Sí, a los no sé por qué, pero a los académicos sí nos encanta escuchar nuestras propias voces, ¿verdad?
Y tenemos que seguir hablando porque lo más importante es...
Así es, así es.
No sé, sí.
satellite must have gone by and lost the transmission.
English on Spanish.
No, I know that. But I just want to somebody asked.
Yeah, I think everybody.
Like I know something. Look it up. I thought I'd ask.
If it's written in Spanish, that means the presentation will be in Spanish. If it's written in English, written in English.
Thank you so much.
Oh, okay, sure.
If you want to.
Yes. Okay.
Whoever is here.
Sure. If the members of the panel are here, I'd like to invite you to come sit up on this main table to make this a bit more panel-esque. So please feel free to join us if you're in the room. Well, it's that time to get started. So let's go ahead and give a round of applause to Maria Angelis Gallego Garcia, who is our first presenter.
Well, in the first place, I would like to thank the organizing committee for organizing such a wonderful, interesting, and impressive conference. And also thank you very much for taking me into account and inviting me. Very special thanks to Yasmin Biel, and also to Bridget Dinka, and also to Gabriela Lemos, who has been answering to all my questions all this time. Thank you to all of you. I would also like to ask for your forgiveness for several things. First of all, for my Spanish accent, but we are in Spanish panel, so I hope you all can be understanding with it. It is the right context. Also because I am not actually a Romance philologist or a Hispanic philologist. My field is Semitic languages. So I might make some mistakes. Again, I ask you to be lenient with my talk. When in 711, a Muslim army led by Tariq bin Ziyad crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula and conquered most of its territories in an astonishing short period of approximately 5 years, a new historical era began in this part of the world, a complete disruption, in fact, with previous history, and it would be another complete disruption after 1492. The Christian Latin society ruled by the Visigoths that the Muslims had first encountered underwent a profound transformation at all levels. New rulers and a new form of government and administration were transferred from the eastern parts of the Islamic Empire to this farthest western land. In addition to political and administrative changes, a deep societal transformation had place in Muslim Iberia. Al-Andalus, as it is known in Arabic. This transformation included fundamental aspects such as family structure and religious affiliation in a similar process to that which had previously taken place in other areas, also conquered by the Muslims, and that had become part of the Islamic empire in the Middle East, in Asia, and in the north of Africa. Language was no exception to this process of transformation. The local varieties of Romance spoken at the time of the Muslim conquest, along with Latin as a language of written culture, were gradually displaced by dialectal Arabic as an everyday language, that's Andalusi Arabic, and by classical Arabic in formal communication. This is a striking evolution, considering the fact that the number of native Arabic speakers in the Iberian Peninsula was very small. The Muslim army that had first arrived was mostly composed by Berbers from the north of Africa who spoke local Berber dialects. And no significant influx of Arab population is recorded to have arrived in later periods. So here we have to assume that it is, as in many other cases, the prestige of the elite, the prestige of the association of the language with political power, with the language of culture, that really made this push for Arabic to become the predominant language. In spite of the numerical disadvantage, and in spite of the fact that the linguistic shift took place between two genetically unrelated languages, which undoubtedly made the transition more complex, we may attest by the 11th century a tendency to monolingualism with Arabic within the population of Al-Andalus. Furthermore, by the 11th century, Romance virtually disappeared from the Muslim sphere. And though we may presume that it was still spoken or in use within Christian circles, the fact is that there is scarcely any evidence for it. The linguistic evolution is closely related to political and historical factors. The 11th century was a turning point in the history of Al-Andalus, since the Christians made a significant progress in their, you see there the different waves of the conquest, from the north to the south, with the main battles and dates. The 11th century was a turning point in the history of Al-Andalus, since the Christians made significant progress in their conquest of the Islamic lands. And as the outcome of this new development in the conflict, the Muslims became obliged to ask for help to two different North African dynasties, the Almoravids and the Almohads, who were both defendants of a rigorous interpretation of Islam. The status of Christian and Jews under Almoravid, and very especially under Almohad rule, severely worsened. And this is arguably the explanation for the sharpening of linguistic attitudes, and more specifically, the demise of Romance in Al-Andalus due to its association with Christianity. But before these historical developments in the 11th century, the linguistic situation from the 8th until the 11th centuries presents a fascinating, rich landscape of languages in contact and progressive configuration of the ideological values attached to each linguistic variety that would prevail in later periods. Since the focus of this paper is Romance, let me first of all note that Romance was used within a diglossic framework. Well, in this context, I'm sure you all know what diglossia is. This is the Ferguson's definition. And it is crucial to take this diglossia into account in order to understand how the evolution of languages in Al-Andalus occurs. Romance was the low form of Latin within the Iberian speech community. It was the native language of the local population, but its domains of use were restricted to informal context, whereas the domains of Latin were those of a high variety: education, religion, formal literature. As it is usually the case also in a diglossic situation, Latin was highly valued within the linguistic community as a language of culture and prestige, whereas Romance was considered a vulgar or corrupted form of Latin. In a very interesting process, when the Muslims arrived in Al-Andalus and came in contact with this diglossia, they acknowledged it. I mean, they didn't speak about it. They didn't know what diglossia was, but they acknowledged it. For instance, in the first years, coins were minted in Al-Andalus with a Latin inscription. The translation of the Arabic, there is no more God, no God but God, la ilaha illallah. That is the fundamental statement of Islam. And well, it only occurred for a short period of time to have it, but the fact that it was in Latin, this inscription is very meaningful, because if the primary purpose of this inscription was to proselytize, to transmit the fundamental principle of Islam, it should have been done in Romance. But we see that there is that linguistic awareness of these two levels in Latin and Romance. We also see that the Muslims were aware of this situation in the denomination that they used for Romance, al-Latini al-Ammi, that is literally vulgar Latin. And it is used in, it is very often found in pharmacological treatises, for instance, in botanical dictionaries, which, by the way, are a very, very rich source of linguistic information, because they take an entry, a term, and then the term has to be translated into many different languages, including vulgar Latin, that is Romance, but also Andalusi dialect, that is usually called the language of the people of Al-Andalus, but also in many other languages. This Latin Romance diglossia had a counterpart among the Arab Muslims, for they also lived in a diglossic situation. On the one hand, they had classical Arabic, the language of the Quran, as a high language for formal communication context, that is religion, poetry, administration, etc., as in the case of Latin. Whereas they had different dialects, developed forms of Arabic as their native tongue, and the language that they used in informal communication. It is, sorry, let me go back. And the value, the association of classical Arabic with Islam, as you can see here, is very, very, very deep and very strong. As opposed to Latin, for instance, does not have that clear sacred value, even though it can be associated to Christianity. But classical Arabic is the sacred language of Islam, and it is considered to be a good quality for a Muslim to dominate the language, to know classical Arabic. Whereas dialectal Arabic, well, it reflects a developed form of the language. It has lost case inflection. It has a more simplified verbal structure, some phonetic shifts, etc. And its existence is usually attributed to a process of corruption of the pure language due to the contact with the non-Arab peoples. This is a topos, and it happens in other diglossias. It's preserved in folklore literature, but also in a very interesting kind of linguistic treatise that compiles the mistakes on the of language, the lahn al-amma. And it's very important to always take into consideration these two diglossias that had place in Al-Andalus, because failing to acknowledge them might lead to the wrong interpretation of facts. For instance, let me go back to this. There were some scholars in the early 20th century who claimed that Arabic had not really been a language used in Al-Andalus, that it was mostly a Romance, Latin society. And interestingly, the proof that they gave was that they thought it was such an exceptional quality that when somebody wrote a biography of some scholar, they would mention it. Oh, and he knows classical Arabic. And they said, well, see, it was so exceptional that they had to mention it. And the same about writing grammars of classical Arabic, which is also a characteristic of in a diglossic situation, that the high language has to be learned through tuition and grammars. And they would say, see, they had to write grammars because they didn't know that language. But they were not differentiating between the two levels. And in these two diglossias that came in contact in Al-Andalus, Classical Arabic, Andalusi Arabic, and Latin and Romance, there were also some mixing in certain period. So this would be what Fishman refers to as an extended diglossia. There could be users of Romance as a native language who were in fact diglossic with Classical Arabic. This is the case of many converts to Islam. They are born in Iberian Peninsula, they are native speakers of Romance, but if they convert to Islam, they have to become instructed in Arabic, they have to learn parts of the Quran, etc. And the same happens with Latin and Romance. You could have a speaker of Romance or a speaker of Andalusi dialectal Arabic, like many monks, Christian monks. They had already Andalusi dialect as the native language, but if they wanted to become clerics, they had to learn and be instructed in Latin. So we will have, again, another extended diglossia. This is just, I brought two examples of, this is the kind of sources that we have to use sometimes because nobody really speaks about language in their references in the Middle Ages, but we can gather from here and there some details. This is a case of one of the martyrs of Cordoba, the so-called martyrs of Cordoba. You know, it was a movement in the 10th century of Christians who wanted to become martyrs, voluntary martyrs, so they would come to the Qadi or they would go to the mosque and insult the Prophet Muhammad or insult Islam that they knew they would be killed for it. So like this one, Isaac of Tabanos, one of the martyrs. I would like, O Qadi, to become an ardent follower of your faith if you will at once explain to me its system and reasonableness. Gladly then, his lying tongue gave forth to him the words of instruction. Suddenly, the youthful and venerable monk, who had been well instructed in Arabic letters, answered him in Arabic. He, that is Muhammad, lied to you, he says, and may he waste away under the divine curse, who, entangled in such sin, seizes upon troops of lost souls and enslaves them with himself in the depths of hell, etc. And so, of course, he became a martyr after saying all this. We also have cases of Muslims using Romance, but see, this is, most of these quotations, I have many more, have been compiled by Al-Hushani, the author of that book, the Book of the Judges of Cordoba. And it is still an early period, so the use of Romance was not associated to any negative connotation. And this is a case that is symbolic, and there are many others like this, of Orthodox or rigorous Muslims who come to court and speak in Romance, and nobody has any problem with that. It says here, at the time, there was in the city an old man whose language was Romance, Ajami Lisan, called Yenair. He used to go before the judges to declare, since he was well known among the people for his good conduct and orthodox belief. The wazirs sent for him and asked him about this judge. He answered in Romance, I do not know him, but I have heard people saying that he is a bad man. And he said that, using a diminutive, we don't know which diminutive, in Romance. And when his words reached the emir, may God have mercy upon him, the emir was admired by his words and said, nothing but truthfulness would have caused this man to utter such a word. He then dismissed him as a judge. However, this situation gradually changed. And I'm going to illustrate how Romance became associated to the language of the enemy and of the Christians through the study of this term of Ajami, which originally only means non-Arabic speaker, a barbaric speaker. And it could refer to Romance or to Persian, any other language that is not Arabic. However, we see a semantic development. First, Ajami becomes identified to Romance, only Romance. So you would not use Ajami for Hebrew or any other language. But eventually, it becomes equal with Christian. It becomes a synonym of Christian. In the historical chronicle, the Muqtada II of Ibn Hayyan, this historian narrates this episode, very interesting, of the surrender of a rebellious group of Christians and also Muwallats, Muslim converts, to the Vizier Hashim ibn Abdelaziz. There is first some fighting, and then they surrender. And Hashim clearly wanted to get rid of all of them. But he used the strategy. He gathered everyone in one place and started to ask to each man, are you a Muslim or Ajami? That is, Romance speaker, Christian, non-Arabic speaker, whatever we want to translate. If they answered Ajami, Hashim ordered to kill them immediately. Here we see that for Hashim, Ajami meant Christian. But to those who answered Muslim, Hashim asked them to recite a surah of the Quran, and then another one, and another one. A good Muslim is supposed to have memorized the Quran as a good Muslim. So he would keep on asking them to recite surahs until they hesitated or made a mistake, giving Hashim an excuse to kill them, saying, had I not told you that he was Ajami, Romance speaker, Christian, until all the men were dead. And here, in spite of the dramatism of this episode, this passage of Ibn Hayyan makes it very clear that Ajami has already acquired the semantic connotation of Christian, not just Romance speaker, but Christian. And since they asked me to speak for 20 minutes, I'm going to just go to one more quotation because, can I? Okay. This is a very illustrative quotation that I would like to comment on because in this case, the language, Romance, is not just the language of the Christian, it is the language of the enemy. And it's a very moving letter written by Abu Mutarrif ibn Muthanna, complaining about how the children of the Muslim aristocracy are usually looked after by slave women who come from the north, from Galicia probably, or from areas of Castile. How far is high from low, the sky from the earth, the light from the darkness, the eloquent expression from the barbarism? Aren't we, people of this peninsula, which is far away from the best nations, and this is actually an idea that appears all the time in the writings of the Muslims, that sense of being peripheral. Well, at the time, of course, Spain was the end of the Western world, and they always think that they are so far from the center of the good nations. For them is the Arabian Peninsula, that I will explain how they speak bad Arabic, how their practice of Islam is not probably the best. So aren't we people of this peninsula, which is far away from the best nations, neighboring the non-Arab masses? Aren't we the worthiest of excuse for our incorrect speaking? Because isn't it true that since one of the sons of your nobility starts to hear when he is born, he does not hear but the words of a despicable slave woman who does not speak Arabic? It says that she is Ajamiya, simple-minded, and the baby does not suckle but from her breast, and does not acquire but her incapability of expression, and is not calm but in her lap, and is not trained but under her direction, to the point that When he becomes a man, culminating his growth, he's in touch with the Christian taifas, since he speaks to them in their languages. He makes an effort in keeping their language, and he's concerned about their social classes and tolerates their habits. Now, in spite of all these complaints, this is not actually something that we can attest that ever happened. Women have, seems, a very active role in the education of children. There is, in fact, a famous ulema, Muslim scholar in Al-Andalus, called Ar-Rushati, and it is not his real name, it was a given name. In one of his writings, he complains that he has to be explaining all the time the origin of his name. And it was because there was one of these slave women who was looking after him, and he had a rose on the cheek, a sign of birth, and she used to call him Rosatello, and that became a Rushati. So, but in spite of the fact that women had a role in the bringing up of children of the nobility, we cannot really consider this as a channel of linguistic changes by any means, because it would become, in the last case, restricted to individuals. So I think I'm going to leave it here and leave room for questions. Thank you. Yes, stop. Sorry, I had not seen that. Sorry. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm very struck by your statement that romance disappeared.
Well, okay, there is no evidence for its existence, I should have said. Sorry. In the 11th century, well, in the Muslim writings, there is no evidence of its use. I mean, claiming that it disappeared, maybe it didn't, but there is no evidence. And if there is no evidence at all, I think we may think that at least its use was very, very limited.
When you have this quote here which says that the people who raised the noble children spoke romance,
Yeah.
they went home, they spoke romance.
Yes, sorry?
Yes, you take this.
Yeah, we see that there's somebody speaking in Romance, but it will be exceptional use. I mean, it would not be something, of course, you can also find in the botanical treatises a reference to Romance as well. But these are exceptional uses. It is not a language alive in the normal use of the population. That's what I meant. But disagree. See?
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. My question would be, so you've shown us that Ajami means non-Arabic speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility that it could also refer to Berber speakers and the influx of Berber slaves who came from the Rif and Central Atlas Mountains?
Well, in the Arabic sources that I know, Berber would be referred to as Barbar, not as Ajami. Or it would say, Lugatuhu la Ajamiya al-Barbariya, but always with Barbariya. Just Ajami by itself would be Romance.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Is there evidence to talk about what the non-Christian, non-Muslim, but rather Jewish population is doing?
Yeah, well, but it is such a known topic that I didn't want to bring it up here because it would be, yeah, of course. I mean, the Jews are characterized in Al-Andalus for their deep Arabization. They wrote wonderfully in Arabic, and also they adapted Arabic to their own idiosyncrasy, and so they wrote Arabic in Hebrew letters, and there is also lexical borrowings of Hebrew in Judeo-Arabic. It's such an interesting topic that I just couldn't bring it up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bridget, should I?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry?
You can just drop it on the desktop.
Right.
Okay.
Which would be here and then here. And actually more. How do we pass the slides? Yeah, great.
Great.
Go ahead.
All right, our second speaker in the panel is Álvaro Octavio de Toledo y Huerta, speaking on historical syntax needs dialectology, lessons from Spanish.
Thank you. So thanks very much for the invitation. There's a handout of sorts which I have here, a pretty massive handout of which I did 40 copies as recommended, but of course that's way beneath the number of you here now. The hand, right.
We can share.
The handout is not necessary to follow the talk. It contains data, just examples in Spanish, non-glossed, because there's loads of them, okay? So maybe you wanted to watch at home later and check that the things I'm saying here are not completely made up or invented, all right? So, the title of the talk contains a pretty evident truism. Historical syntax needs dialectology. Everybody knows that. So let me clarify, I don't intend this as a general theoretical claim, but as a particular vindication concerning the history of Spanish. Because, as I have tried to explain in the abstract, although Menéndez Pidal, the founder of any serious historical linguistics for the Spanish-speaking world, came up with a fine panorama of Castilian dialects in the 11th and early 12th centuries, Castile being at the time that rather small territory in the middle, very narrow to the north and a little broader south. For the time between the end of the 12th century and the mid-13th century, now you know that map from the previous talk, that's the Reconquista. However, as Castile rapidly expanded southwards to become everything between the green line to the west, the border to Portugal, and the red line to the east, except that tiny violet corner in the southeast, which is Granada, for that period, the second period, Pidal saw things quite differently. For him, territorial expansion and the search of a literary standard helped in producing a unified variety which totally wiped out Western and Eastern dialectal features within the realm. By paying attention only to sound change on literary text, at least from the mid-12th century onwards, he put forth an oversimplified vision, which has definitely had an influence in hampering historical dialectal research beyond that very early period on which Pidal focused. As Fernández Ordóñez has repeatedly stated in recent years, we've got the relevant quotations there. So my first concern here today will be to show, by means of just one telling example from a grammatical construction, that significant internal divisions were at work within Castile, still in the 13th and 14th centuries. Now, Fernández Ordóñez herself and her students after her have done wonderful work and very convincingly have shown that some typical central Castilian features, like the famous leísmo, do not extend to the western or eastern corners of the former kingdom, as you can see on that map. And neither did leísmo reach the south, hence probably its absence in the Americas. There you see the current distribution of leísmo in the Coser Atlas, and these are the data from the Alpi Atlas almost 100 years ago, which almost fully coincide, allowing us to project farther back following the uniformitarian hypothesis. But still, Leismus shows again central Castile versus the rest of the world. So I would like here to prove Pidal wrong in that there are dialectally differentiated medieval phenomena whose borders, or isoglosses, run north to south across the very heart of Castile. Now let's take, for instance, the Castilian versified history of Alexander the Great, of which we have 2 extant manuscripts, O, with clear Western or Leonese features, and P, clearly copied in the East. On 3 different occasions, O resorts to location adverbials built on the word cima, meaning summit, still today, whereas P, in those very same contexts, displays the word somo, a different, now lost word for top or summit. The same contrast obtains between a Western text like the Galician Cantigas by Alfonso X, which only show thema in all those contexts, and a text composed in Eastern Burgos, the Miracles of St. Dominic by Pedro Marin, which only display somo, like the equally Eastern Cantar de Mio Cid. If we now correlate the attestations of both thema and somo in adverbials and current toponymy, that is places where hills or mountaintops or higher parts of towns or roads are still called somos or named with derivatives of thema, such as thimero or thimada, these are the results. A perfect match in Burgos, which you're seeing there, with charters that contain adverbials with somo marked with red stars for the 13th century and violet stars for the 14th century, and current places called somo in the green circles. Same thing for nearby La Rioja, both in its western and eastern part. And same thing for the territories surrounding Burgos to the north. Those would be the Roman-speaking parts of the Basque Country, Santander, and northwestern Palencia. Thus building a whole eastern half of the Castilian kingdom where only somo appears, both in old charters and in modern toponymy. But if we go west to Asturias and León, we only find thema in the medieval charters, and only derivatives thereof, like thimero or thimada, as toponyms, no trace of somo. Also, family names in the current distribution show this division with Cimas or Cimadevilla in the western half and Somovilla or Somavilla to the east. And on a larger scale, if we go to the whole peninsula, I don't have a pointer here, but it's just a little unfortunate, it's too far away anyway, we can still see Cima dominating in Extremadura, that's to the west near Portugal, you see the bluish mass there. Whereas we see Somo and related forms having a clear continuity to the east into Navarre, central and southern Aragon, and even western and southern Valencia and the eastern part of New Castile or Castilla-La Mancha, with an interesting northern continuation into France over Gascon dialects. Somme is a word there in Gascon. A general sketchy map of Thema, the blue limited area, and Somo, the green varieties, stresses this east-west divide where 13th and 14th century data still match extant names of places and persons. A divide that is not only Hispanic, but actually extends into France, with some and related forms found in the southwest, but also in the north, including Picard and Champenois medieval data, and of course Anglo-Norman. But let's get back to Iberia, now by the turn of the Middle Ages, the 15th century. As you possibly know, modern Spanish displays an articulate system of 3 elements expressing inferiority, or lower position. A preposition, bajo, only attested from the 18th century onwards, a transitive or complement-taking adverb debajo, and an intransitive adverb abajo, which originally couldn't take on a complement. The same morphological articulation is found for posteriority relations, things expressing behind, with tras, detrás, and atrás. But this wasn't always so. If we look up the first attestations of debajo in the large Corde corpus, And, which is important, we clear away the data contained in late copies from the 15th century or even later, which I have marked there in red. The earliest examples turn out to be Aragonese. And the same result obtains if we look for abajo, once the unreliable data from late copies are removed. Equally Aragonese is a use of bajo as an adverb, not a preposition, up to the present, which could take on a complement by means of de. Bajo del castillo, literally under of the keep, which you have in bold on the slide. And only to be found in Eastern texts, even though apparently already written in the Castilian-based standard variety, is the use of bajo directly introducing its complement between the 16th and early 18th century. Those are the examples in green. Since only Eastern varieties allowed for adverbs to drop the linking preposition de. This never happened in Castilian, only in the East. You see some examples from other adverbials in blue. And this is, of course, also usual throughout the history of Catalan or French. It's totally untypical for Castilian, but typical for other varieties to the east and the north. The same, by the way, applies to atrás and detrás, which are clearly of Eastern origin and reached Castile only in the 15th century. Thus, the formation of a Castilian-based standard for the reunited territory we call Spain was permeated, also in the syntax, by significant influences from the Eastern realm of Aragon, whose varieties became prestigious as they vehicled into Castile the novel cultural input of Italian Trecento and early humanism. These prestigious borrowings from the East did, of course, reach and are present in every variety of American Spanish. So we have to conceive that pitch as an open pitch with influence coming in from the East in the 15th century. The role of Castilian as a base for the Spanish standard has in turn sometimes obscured the effects of Castilian differentiality beyond the 16th century. For instance, the emergence of the short form hemos instead of long habemos is traditionally regarded as a general process that took place along the Spanish Golden Age. But things are a little more complicated, and there's a dialectal twist to this evolution. In Romance, some varieties preserve only the long forms for the first and second persons plural, like French or Standard Italian, while in others, significantly Catalan and Portuguese, to the east and west of Iberia, both long and short forms coexist. Only Spanish has shortened both, a process possibly triggered by the phonetic reduction of abedes into abes already in the 15th century, which put an illogical pressure on habemos to similarly become two-syllable. This is a classical explanation. Throughout the Middle Ages, though, Castilian only displays the shortened form hemos in a particular construction, a futurate periphrasis known as futuro analítico, analytical future, cantarlo hemos. It's a sort of equivalent to the future, which I can't translate into English. But however, both Western and Eastern varieties display short forms alongside long forms during the 13th and 14th century in other constructions, such as the obligative periphrasis, have to plus an infinitive, and the perfect, have plus a participle, which are built as in English. Castile, these are the data for the West and Eastern territories, displaying the short form in the 13th and 14th centuries in those contexts. And Castilian data in green there only come about, hemos, the short form, only appears in obligative periphrasis of the perfect after 1425, as you can see on that slide. But from the end of the 15th century, hemos rapidly wins over habemos in all contexts, starting, crucially, with the obligative periphrasis, which is semantically more akin to the futurate periphrases, and only later extending to perfects, as data from the Corde clearly show. The standard adopted this Central Castilian syntactic extension and eliminated long habemos by 1650. But regionally, habemos resisted until today in all peripheral regions, including Andalusia, as you can see, but also the West and the East. That's a different representation for the same points. And including, of course, America, where habemos also survived, and the form has been best preserved in its only non-periphrastic use, the existential, documented since the second half of the 17th century on both sides of the Atlantic. And going back to a generic construction with a locative complement attested since the early literary monuments. What I'm interested in here is that the whole reconstruction is not even possible without taking dialectal data into account. And now, do I still have 5 minutes or so? Yes. Great. And we are now finally crossing the ocean to challenge the otherwise reasonable assumption that American Spanish derives largely from Western Andalusian varieties, leveled at different stages and to varying degrees through contact with Central Castilian and speakers of the Castilian-based standard. An interesting example is provided by the rather marginal quantifier algotro, some other person or some other thing. It can have both animate and inanimate reference, which the Diccionario de la Lengua Española, the newest one, characterizes as being used in several American countries. You can see the whole list in the blue line in the first definition, and also in Andalusia. And there is evidence that this form, although under heavy normative pressure from purists, as you see on the meme in the left, which means you don't say algotro, but algún otro, did you know? Okay? However, we have evidence that it is quite common in some regions, such as central Colombia, including Bogotá and Medellín. All but maybe the youngest among you will probably recognize the character on the right as Pablo Escobar, to which that phrase is attributed, algo otro que esté molestando, some other person bugging around. Okay? Since it is clearly substandard, very few examples, just 7, turn up in large conventional corpora. I'm adding up the results of 6 or 7 large corpora there, and just 7 examples come up, confirming usage in Colombia, Guatemala, and at least northern Mexico and New Mexico, so it could be used here 300 years ago, who knows, possibly. Along with Spanish Extremadura, as you can see in the last example there, but not Andalusia. Most other American countries contribute examples. If we extend the search to Google Books, you've got all the data on the handout. And just Google, where some examples confirm its great vitality in, where some samples, sorry, I made, confirm its vitality in El Salvador, its relative persistence in Colombia and Mexico, and its scarcity in Venezuela or Peru, where it is only found in the northern province of Piura on the border with Ecuador. In Spain, on the other hand, Andalusia emerges only marginally, whereas the data clearly point to Extremadura and more to the west, to what once was the Archbishopric of Toledo. These are the blue elements on the map, the red being of a typical southeastern form, Mengajo, which I used just to check that the data were more or less correct, that I wasn't being misled by what I found in Google. The form must have spread thus from Extremadura into Toledo, possibly along the droveways that connect these regions over the town of Talavera, and then farther south along the Quicksilver route that thrived in the 17th century. Over that century, the region of Toledo lost almost a third of its population, not by famines as much as through emigration, and that's very probably how algotro, this Western form, reached America. Similar stories can be told for Eastern grammatical constructions, such as en igual de, for instead of, that spread from Valencian, we've got a representative here, to Eastern Castilian and reached some diffusion in the 18th century, but is only found today in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, as far as I know. If someone else knows instances of en igual de used as instead of, please tell me. I just found them in Sinaloa, of all the Hispanic world, but it originated in contact among Valencian speakers and Castilian speakers in the East. I don't have time to go into the details, but let me make just one final remark. Dialectal splits separating American from European Spanish are rarely found in the syntax during the Golden Age. As we have seen in some of the processes here, it is in the late 17th century, or even more typically in the 18th century, when American varieties start showing grammatical divergence with regard to the metropolis. This is also true, for instance, for degree exclamative and interrogative quantifiers. That would be Mexican que tan, which was already the form employed by Cervantes, as you can see there, as in classical Spanish, versus como de alta es tu hermana, how tall is your sister, versus que tan alta es tu hermana. With the other American territories tending to one or the other pole, either the Spanish usage or the Mexican usage, to varying degrees. And this happens for many other constructions and grammatical elements, and could only, of course, happen in the second half of the 17th or the 18th century. This is typical. If you look for dialectal divergence in the morphosyntax in the 16th and early 17th century, you will probably be frustrated. Now, here's a brief recapitulation of what we have seen, because I don't have time to read all those conclusions out. I'll leave them there. Thank you very much for your attention.
And we have 5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Rina.
It's very interesting, if I understood correctly, that you have common pathways of evolution, even in the different dialects. For example, the emos, that you have different syntactic context that begins with the future or the destination meaning. And I'm interested in your placement of the existential, because as you said, that's something that is currently variable in modern Spanish varieties, the haber, the unconjugated haber, and the agreeing haber. And do you think that the first person plural is the heart of the agreement pattern, and then it spreads to the, you have habemos, right? But then there's also habían. So based on your studies of this, what do you think? Can you help us understand this?
Yeah, well, that's more than one question, actually. But first of all, what I'm claiming is that in Castile, there was an extension over syntactic context. Whereas in the East and the West, both forms, the long and the short, coexisted in all contexts from the very beginning until now. Okay? That's what I'm claiming. And that's the case for Portuguese, and that's the case for Catalan today. And that must have been the case, as the data show, for medieval Leonese and Aragonese. Castilian was differential in this sense, but we haven't perceived it because this happened in the 16th, 17th centuries, and we're not used to conceive Castilian as a dialect as late as the 16th, 17th centuries, okay? And then in Castile, it was already conditioned by syntax. It only happened in the future, in the futuro analítico, in that periphrasis, and it extended over syntactic context, which explains why it absolutely generalized so quickly, in my opinion. In other areas, habemos is attested in all constructions, including the perfect, even up to today. I've recently found Cuban data for habemos cantado, as you have in Andalusia with the perfect. But it's more resistant with the existential. Why? Possibly because that's a more lexical use, if you want to put it that way. It's not used in a periphrasis. An existential is a very bleached use, if you want, but it's a main verb. So I think that's how the story went. And your second question was, what's the relationship between this and the third-person plural agreement? Well, those are different agreements because in the other agreement, for those of you who maybe don't know that much Spanish, is the typical agreement you can also find in Italian between c'è tre persone, ci sono tre persone. Well, you would agree on the plural, the singular. You don't expect that, of course, with an existential stemming from haber, because it's not a be verb. It's not supposed to agree. And you also find that in Spanish from the 15th century onwards. So to begin with, the attestations are earlier. And second, in that case, you can agree there's a reanalysis of the pivot, the subject, which is plural and induces plural agreement on the verb. But there's nothing similar you can argument for habemos. The plural is not just a plural agreement, it's a person marking agreement. So the origin must be different. And I think the origins in contexts such as these ones, where you would say, in this city, we, a generic collective, we have many drunken. Okay, which basically means there are many drunken people in this town. And those examples you find from the Middle Ages. So if your final question is, do I agree with people that have been writing this is a phenomenon of acceptation, this is an example of acceptation, my answer is no, this is a continuation. Nobody has, I think. Sorry.
Did you, through your research, did you do a differentiation between literary works and documentation from archives?
Yes, of course, yes. I didn't have much time to mention that, but of course the example from the charters I'm used for the SOMO examples all stem from charters, not literary texts, because they're useless. I mean, in Alphonsine texts, in texts from Alfonso X, you will find thema and somo, because they were written by many hands coming from different parts of the territory. And that was an isogloss that divided Castile into two halves. Now, on the handout, you can, I think, neatly see in the first page, I put the locations of every example I found, and you can very easily see, I don't have a handout myself here, but if I just read it aloud, you will realize it immediately. You find thema in Avilés, Salamanca, Carrizo, León, León, Carrizo, Salamanca, Terradillos, Salamanca, Ávila, Valdecorneja. Those are all charters, all to the west. Whereas you find Somo in Valpuesta, Santoña, Belbimbre, Olburgos, Cardeña, Burgos, Santoña, Santander, Oña, Burgos, Silos, Burgos, Santoña, Silos, El Moral, Lerma, Aguilar de Campo. You've got the whole list here, and there is no exception. Every example of thema in a charter is from the west. Every example of Somo is from the east in the 13th, 14th centuries. So, of course, yes, you have to use charters for that kind of research. Concerning debajo, abajo, it doesn't really matter. You take the corde, you take both examples from charters and literary texts, and it all yields the same, which is it was Aragonese. Once, of course, you take the philological caution to clear out all the data that are dated by its composition date on the corde, but which actually are found in later copies. That's something we need to do also in historical syntax generally, not just dialectology.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I think it's time for our. Oh, sure.
That's all right with me. I don't know. Yeah. Why am I using X instead of long I or J? Okay, because that's the way it was written in the Middle Ages, okay? It was not pronounced bajo, abajo, debajo, but baixo, abaixo, debaixo, as Quixote, nowadays Quijote, okay? And the way it was written was with an X. So if you want to look for 15th century examples on that corpus, you've got to do it with an X, because you won't find very many with a J, as editors tend to respect the old writing form.
Well, let's thank Alvaro for a wonderful
I think
presentation.
that's-
Oh, there's
okay.
one more. I'm sorry. I jumped the gun.
Just wanted to say, if I have a question. You mentioned
I need you to be a little louder. I'm sorry. I'm not hearing well.
You mentioned, you talk about Leonés and Navarro, and we know that you discuss literature as part of Spanish or not, or the different languages. Your examples are, in some cases, are really in the Leonés region. Do you think that doesn't have anything to do, because you're talking about Castilian as one language. I don't know if you have anything to say about the interaction with other languages.
Yes, of course, yes. That's what I'm expecting. I've been talking about the whole time. I refer to them as varieties, in the Middle Ages, Eastern, Western varieties, and so on. When I talk about Castile, I refer to the kingdom, the political unit. And within that political unit, of course, you have many different varieties. Is that enough to clarify things? Great.
Now let's have that aplauso for Aymara. And now we will all enjoy our lunch break, and we'll reconvene back here at 1:30 for the next presentation. Thank you all. Can I ask you a question?
Of course, yes.
Now, how can you account for the voz form variation, the auxiliary variation between like has comido and habéis comido? Does that have anything to do with this extension that you're proposing?
The voceo, well, it has to do with the abbreviation of the habedes form into